Hello everyone, and welcome to the Drydock episode 228. This, if it's going live at the correct time, will be going live, technically speaking, on the 1st of January, but nevertheless is the December Patreon Drydock, so let's get on with questions. Dave Peachy asks, Fort Drum in the Philippines was, when completed in the late 1910s, armed with a pair of twin 14-inch naval gun turrets, and these were never upgraded in the interwar years. I believe there were both economic and treaty-related reasons for this happening. However, if they had been upgraded to 15 or even 16-inch guns once the treaty system broke down in the mid-1930s, would this have made a substantial difference to the Japanese capture of the Philippine Islands, even if it's only delaying it? I don't think it would manifestly affect all that much, to be perfectly honest. They were using counter-battery fire against Japanese forces on land in the vicinity, but aside from being a slightly bigger shell and therefore possibly causing slightly more damage and or casualties, having a 15-inch or 16-inch pair of twin turrets instead of 14-inch isn't going to change that all that much. And they did engage and sink some landing vessels. Again, a 14, 15 or 16-inch shell is pretty much going to do equal amounts of damage. The only way that 15 or 16-inch guns could make any kind of significant difference would be, in theory, they might have a longer range, but none of the targets that Fort Drum engaged were anything close to its theoretical maximum range anyway, and of course a newer 15 or 16-inch gun might have more armour penetration, but you have to, account for the fact that, as you can see in this photo, the bay that Fort Drum is in is not exactly the world's largest. So at those kind of ranges, unless Yamato was hovering at the very furthest edge of things, anything else is going to be entirely within the capability of the 14-inch guns to damage or destroy. And even with Yamato, at these kinds of ranges, even if it was in the furthest part of the bay that the guns can reach and that Yamato can fire back at, it would still be at significant risk, and a slightly increased caliber probably isn't going to change all that much. Now, granted, there are some parts of the interior part of Manila Bay, and of course the open sea, the South China Sea to the west, where the longer range of a 15 or 16-inch gun might allow them to engage targets further along. But generally speaking, the fort wasn't really designed for that. The fort was designed to guard the entrance, where you've got corregidor, etc. And that entrance is, at most, if a ship's sailing through the entrance, at most you're looking at maybe 10 miles. And that's being really generous with a ship at the entrance of the harbour at the far northwest. So at that point, as I say, any capital ship grade gun that's of about this caliber is going to be fine. HMS Inadvisable asks, my impression from Douglas Reamond's naval novel is that there was a common fear that many Royal Navy sailors had, shrapnel flying through voice pipes during communication. How much was this belief grounded in reality, and if so, what steps were taken to mitigate it other than switching to electrical communications? I think it's one of those things that's kind of 50-50. On the one hand, an explosion powerful enough to propel shrapnel down a voice pipe, which, as you can see, is not exactly going to be a straight line. If the shrapnel's travelling that fast, it's probably going to embed itself in the pipe at a turn or something like that. And or the explosion's powerful enough, it's just going to have bent and destroyed the voice pipe anyway. So, strictly speaking, you would have to be immensely unlucky for anything smaller than tiny paint chips and so forth to be blown down a voice pipe by an explosion, albeit that obviously your face is going to be right next to it, so if you're speaking and there is an explosion on the other end, then you might get a load of, I guess, what you might call micro shrapnel straight to the face, where eyes and such are, which would be fairly detrimental to you. And they are, technically speaking, a weak spot because they are a direct line to the outside where an explosion might occur. You do also have to factor in that you've got just blast and flash or fire, which might very well be propelled down the voice pipe by a slightly less powerful explosion, and that to the face is not really going to be all that much better than micro shrapnel. And if there is an explosion that's powerful enough to send a heavy blast pressure wave down, apart from the blast wave itself, you've also got to account for all sorts of things that might have built up within the voice pipe, whether that be corrosion or rust, depending on what the voice pipe is made of, various bits and pieces that have dropped down there either accidentally or on purpose over the years, and all of those which are already partway down the voice pipe might be picked up by a blast wave and then catapulted through into the face of whichever unlucky person who would happen to be speaking into it at the time. So in terms of should you be worried about speaking into a voice pipe during combat when there's a possibility that the other end might be being blown up? Yes, that's a perfectly valid fear. It's somewhat unlikely to be shrapnel from the explosion itself at the other end that makes it through, but other stuff could come through, which validates the worry generally. In terms of mitigation, there's not a tremendous amount you can do, to be perfectly honest, because as you might notice if you see museum ships, a lot of voice pipes will have covers over them. But if you are speaking into them, then obviously you have taken the covers away, and that would be the main way to stop or mitigate the effects of blast and shrapnel and flash from coming down the voice pipe. But if you're using them, they have to be out of the way, at which point there's not a huge amount you can do, because anything you put in the way that would potentially block stuff coming down either would also block the voice coming down or going up, which would then make the whole thing pointless, or potentially could become part of the shrapnel itself. So if you put, say a small grid halfway down the pipe to catch bits of shrapnel coming down that way, assuming that didn't completely destroy the point of it being a voice pipe in the first place, an explosion that's powerful enough to send high-speed shrapnel down the pipe, or just a blast wave without shrapnel, might very well partially disintegrate or destroy the grid, which then becomes shrapnel, which isn't going to help. Joao Rita asks, imagine if instead of 3 triple 16-inch on the Nelson class, the Royal Navy fitted it with 3 triple 15-inch 42s. Maintaining the same level of protection and engine power, and the same overall design, simply replacing the turrets, would the savings in weight be enough to give it another 2 to 3 knots of speed? And if so, do you think it would be worth it? The short answer is no, because if you compare the weight of the 16-inch guns to the 1542s, you're only saving somewhere between 6 and 7 tons per gun by downgrading, at which point you're saving less than, around about 50 tons, give or take a little bit, by replacing all 9 16-inch guns with 15-inch. Now, of course, if you do that, then technically speaking, the shell hoists are also slightly smaller, and the overall weight of the ammunition, assuming you're carrying the same amount of rounds per gun, might also be slightly less. But overall, having triple 16 versus triple 15 and nothing else changing is only going to save you at most a few hundred tons, and that difference in weight is going to be more than made up for by just bringing on crew and supplies adds more weight to that. The difference between standard and full load displacement is considerably more than a few hundred tons. Now, a few hundred tons of weight overall saved in the ship might be very useful. It might allow them to, say, do something like not remove quite so many structural elements or thin them down in the turrets, which led to a lot of the problems that they had with the turrets. But if you don't change anything else about the class, it's barely going to be noticeable. However, carrying that idea a little bit forward, if you were going to say, okay, the ship's going to be armed with triple 15s in some way, shape or form, kind of like an F3, but you're not going to go with the F3 design, just tweak the Nelson's design, then at that point you might be able to get a bit more speed out of it. I'm not sure if you'd get 2 to 3 extra knots, which would push them up to sort of 25, 26 knot ships, because, look at the sacrifices the Nagata has had to make to get to that kind of speed regimen. But with an all-forward design, bearing in mind that you've the guns are a little bit shorter. They're 42 caliber as opposed to 45 caliber, and it's 15 inch as the caliber as opposed to 16. Now, that makes the overall length from the back of the turret to the front of the guns about 7.5 foot shorter, which might have some interesting effects. I mean, also with the 15-inch gun, the gun turret can also be a fraction smaller, because the 15-inch is just a physically slightly smaller gun than the 16, excuse me. A little bit of hiccups there. But with a very slightly reduced turret size and slightly reduced turret mass, and a gun set that is 7.5 foot shorter per turret, you might want to bring B turret slightly further forward. In fact, you might have to do it to stop the blast effect shattering the rangefinders of a turret, at which point, also, as you can see, the aftmost turret, whether you call it C or X turret, has a little bit of a problem in that the guns are very, very close to the aft barbette of B. Now, if you're willing to maintain that distance, you've got 7.5 foot to play with. So in addition to moving B a little bit further forward, then you might also move C considerably further forward, at which point you might have freed up 12, 15, maybe even 20 feet aft of the last main gun turret. And if you can then work out the ship's balance and trim to bring the superstructure forward by the same amount, that might open up the ship's machinery spaces enough that with a little bit of playing around, you might be able to get a few extra boilers down there, increasing the power to the ship, and thus increasing the top speed a little. Ryan Frederick asks, what are some examples that, for their time, absolutely sold out in the direction of either speed, armour or firepower, and what were some of the consequences of going all in for one attribute? It's relatively difficult to find examples of ships that went all out just on one thing. I mean, you can look at, say, the Italia class, the ironclads, that is. Now, they definitely sold out in terms of dropping pretty much all of their armour, but in exchange they got very heavy firepower and, for their time, high speed. So they were dropping one in exchange for two others. And when you see ships that have gone to an extreme, it's usually something like that, where they've dropped one of the three in exchange for boost to the other two. However, you do occasionally get ships for very, very, very specific roles that have gone down just one route. So monitors, for example, like Erebus, Terra, Raglan, etc., they're an example of just firepower, because essentially it's, what do we need to transport a pair of 14 or 15-inch guns across the ocean? Doesn't have to be fast, doesn't have to be particularly well protected, apart from maybe the bulges against torpedoes, but they don't have any real armour to speak of. They're literally just gun platforms. The Far di Bruno, the Italian raft with a shed on it with a 15-inch gun attached. You know, that, again, it's a monitor, it's another ultimate example of just firepower and above all else. You've got things like the Abdeel class mine layers, which you can see here, which in a way you could argue went purely for speed, because at their size, they're the size and displacement of a small cruiser, albeit a very small one, but they don't really have the firepower any more substantial than a particularly large destroyer, all things considered. They certainly don't have the firepower of a cruiser of their approximate displacement. And, of course, being a relatively small ship, they also have fairly negligible armour, but what they do have is extreme speed. You know, these things, they're 50 to 80% greater displacement than the largest Royal Navy destroyers that are being built at roughly the same time, the Tribals, JKs, Ls, etc. And they have much less fire. They've got no torpedoes, they've got much less firepower than a Tribal class. They've only got 6 guns and they're 4-inch guns, and even the JKs and Ls, where they've dropped down to 6 guns as well, they're 4.7s, not 4s, but they've bought 40 knots. So usually, if you have a ship that, if you like, has sold out purely down one of these lines, you'll find it's a very, very specialist ship, and usually they actually do a relatively decent job of things, because there must be a very specialist niche role that requires this very particular set of capabilities, which usually means a fair bit of expertise goes into the design. Whereas if you look at ships that maybe have gone down 2 and sacrificed 1, they tend to be either by design or certainly by use more generalist vessels, at which point either the sacrifice they've made in one department doesn't help them or hinders them, or perhaps one of the two things they've boosted turns out to be not quite as useful as they otherwise thought. Gregory Albert asks, of each ship class, which ship can be labelled as ship too angry to die? So the battleship and carrier categories are pretty easy. You just look at which ships were basically halfway to being floating wrecks by the end of their respective campaigns, at which point it's got to be Enterprise, CV6 and Warspite. This is just one of several incidents in which Enterprise was badly damaged, but would always come back fighting. And Warspite, of course, she took a Fritz X, a bomb that destroyed a much larger and, on paper, superior vessel in the Roma. But, Warspite hit by a Fritz X, yes, crippled, but came back to fight at D-Day and so on and so forth, and eventually refused to even go to the scrappers. So Warspite and Enterprise in the top end categories. On the lower end of things for destroyers, there's a lot of different candidates, but given the Swiss cheese that USS Johnston was turned into, she'd probably be the leading or a leading candidate for that. When it comes to cruisers, it's a little bit more interesting, because cruisers do tend to, if you really, really batter them, cruisers do tend to sink quite quickly. But I suppose for, technically speaking, heavy cruisers, you could probably nominate Exeter at the Battle of River Plate, considering that she was hit multiple times by, not by World War II standards particularly brilliant capital ship grade guns, but capital ship grade guns nonetheless, and not only stayed afloat but continued fighting until literally the very last system was knocked out. Although at the same time, Exeter was worked over by multiple hits, but you could look at other ships, like, for example, USS Boise, which had a literal magazine explosion and still stayed afloat. And then you get into the more esoteric stuff, like, for example, HMS Zubian, where you have HMS Zulu and HMS Nubian with their bow and stern, depending on which ship you're looking at, blown off, but half a destroyer remains stubbornly afloat, and then by the power of fusion joined together to form a single destroyer which goes out to fight again. That's another good example. Synchroscore asks, during World War I, the Kaiserliche Marine deployed mines from submarines off the UK and US coasts. Why didn't Germany and Japan try the same thing during World War II? German and Japanese submarines cross the Atlantic and the Pacific, so we know it's not a question of range. Even without a repeat of USS San Diego, minefields in Chesapeake Bay or Puget Sound would cause plenty of mischief and tie up men and equipment to deal with them that could be better employed fighting overseas. Both the German and Japanese navies in World War II did have dedicated mine-laying submarines, albeit that very often they were converted either wholly or partially into cargo subs, as well as having submarines. Their normal submarines could also carry mines if required. But there was a fundamental problem with mine-laying submarines, at least if you're the Germans or the Japanese, and to a lesser extent the British, although the Grampus class did have some success, which is that in World War I, if you were going to lay mines, bearing in mind that mine sweeping techniques are not particularly advanced, so it will take quite a while to guarantee a safe channel, but also in terms of defence, a submarine cannot carry that many mines. It can carry a few more mines than it can torpedoes, but when you look at the size of the dedicated mine-laying submarines, which are considered to be carrying a useful number of mines for the amount of resources and investment you're making in it, they're pretty large ships or boats for the size of submarines at the time. And so you're faced with the problem that the average sub, if it is going to go through all the trouble of getting to the US east or west coasts, can only deploy a very limited number of mines in the first place. Minesweeping technology has advanced considerably, so if you are going to lay mines in somewhere like Chesapeake Bay, then as soon as one of them goes off and minesweeping efforts commence, you'll they'll probably have most of the relevant ones swept relatively swiftly, so the disruptive effect isn't going to be as much as it was in World War One. And because submarine hunting technology has improved, in World War One, if you were going into a bay or a harbour to lay mines, then as long as you, say, took some long-distance observations while you were recharging at night, and then dived to lay the mines during the day, for example, as long as you stayed underwater and deployed mines, there was very little chance of you being detected unless you ran into a net or something, or a defensive minefield, which is the other problem. But in World War II, of course, they had much more advanced hydrophones and they had active sonar, so a rather delicate area like a harbour not only will have patrolling anti-submarine warfare vessels that will have sonar and hydrophones deployed, but there'll also be a lot more and better aircraft deployed, so the chances of you being spotted in relatively shallow harbour waters, even if you never surface while doing your mine laying, are much higher. So your risk is considerably higher, your reward is considerably lower because of the aforementioned better minesweeping techniques, and compared to all of that, it's actually much, much easier and theoretically more reliable to just take a submarine with torpedoes and torpedo stuff off of the east and west coasts generally, if you can, because, well, the US is going to have trouble monitoring the entirety of its coastline unless it really, digs its oars in. Now, where you might have a bit more success in terms of your risk-reward factor would be perhaps to identify certain shipping routes rather than go for the harbours. If you know that, well, there's this particular channel up one of the US coasts that is frequented by a lot of merchant ships, you could perhaps randomly scatter mines through that channel, assuming the water conditions are right for the laying of mines, and it'll take a while, but eventually someone will hit a mine, and sweeping that entire channel and working out how many mines there were, have you done it properly, etc., that could cause a lot more disruption. But it's also a bit luck of the draw, because there's no guarantee that a ship will hit any mines while the mines are serviceable and operational, because the sea is a big place. And there's also the possibility that unless it's a very specific kind of channel, which will make the sweeping efforts easier, if it's just a kind of, well, we generally like to come up and down this area, then the Allies can just go, okay, everyone, well, you're now going to sail 30 miles off to one side of this area until we're satisfied that it's safe. So compared to guaranteed torpedoings, which, relatively speaking, you'll probably pull off, the advances in anti-submarine warfare and patrol technology and minesweeping technology by World War II meant that the investment in a large mine-laying submarine or sending in a normal submarine fitted with a small number of mines, it just wasn't worth it. If you were going to go for laying minefields off of enemy harbours, you wanted to do a lot of them, or you wanted to do it with platforms that were at considerably less risk, hence the use of either disguised merchant ships or aircraft to do most of the mine laying by the Japanese and Germans in World War II. That's not to say they didn't lay mines with subs, they did, but they weren't quite as important in the mine laying efforts as perhaps they had been at times during the First World War. Jay Lozier asks, when radar replaced mast-mounted rangefinders, what was the overall effect on ship stability? I remember seeing photos of US Navy treaty cruisers without radar in the 30s and wondered if there was a significant weight difference. So overall, the effect of radar on ship stability was usually to make it considerably worse because of the additional top weight, but it varied from ship to ship and period to period during the Second World War and immediately thereafter. And that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, radar wasn't necessarily always reliable, and resolution, etc., could be a little bit iffy, at which point you would often find that ships would retain the optical rangefinders and radar, gunnery control radar, which meant that you would have additional weight, not replacement weight. Plus, you also had the problem that whilst you might have a rangefinder at the top of a ship, if you had the era of radar coming in, then you would have, at least towards the end of the Second World War, surface search radar, air search radar, gunnery control radar, and you might have more than one of each installation, plus your anti-aircraft fire control radars, plus maybe short-range surface and air search radar, although your short-range surface search radar could also be your gunnery control radar. And so you'd end up with lots of individual installations. So whereas perhaps if you've got a high-mounted main rangefinder and you add a surface search radar to the mix, that might not be too bad on a lot of ships. But when you've got a dozen plus radar installations all high up in the ship, and bearing in mind that this is World War II or immediate post-World War II tech, so if you want a relatively high power long-range radar, it's going to usually be relatively large and therefore heavy as compared to some later radars. That's when you start having stability issues, and that's where you start seeing people rebuilding superstructures, rebuilding masts. This is obviously, for example, this is the superstructure and foremast of USS New Jersey. And if you compare it to World War II photos, you can see that the foremast has been massively rebuilt, albeit a lot of these radars are obviously considerably post-World War II. But, it's been rebuilt to support a much larger radar, and you can actually see on the top of the superstructure, you've got a radar sitting on top of the Mark 38 system. And then you've got another electronic device of some description on a platform forward, and so on and so forth. And this was a major concern during World War II. When you had cruisers and battleships, etc., with radar being added to them, there were concerns about the proliferation of radar and how much effect this was having on top weight and therefore stability, as well as obviously on destroyers, where it was very pronounced, as we've seen recently with the Typhoon Cobra video, as well as obviously anti-aircraft guns and so on and so forth. But when it started to get a real concern with older ships, they either wouldn't have as many radars installed as newer ships because they were older, they had slightly less utility anyway, or if even a relatively new ship was having serious issues, Belfast, for example, then you could go in and rebuild part or all of a ship's upper works. So Belfast gets rid of the curved superstructure and embraces a more angular superstructure, gets rid of her tripod mast and gets lattice masts, and you have a similar thing happening here with New Jersey, although she doesn't get her entire superstructure rebuilt. John Graubard asks, was the French victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake or the Battle of the Capes, which was decisive for the American Revolution's success, due more to their acts or due to British incompetence? I would say actually it's a very close mixture of both, because as you can see here in this painting, the British were attacking from windward, so they had the opportunity to close the action as they wanted. Unfortunately for them, Admiral Graves hosted two conflicting signals, one for line of battle, which meant, stick to your line and follow the flagship, which would mean a slowly closing engagement, almost like a zipper closing up. But he also hoisted close action, which generally speaking meant break the line and attack as soon as humanly possible, which would have put the British at a considerable advantage, because as I said, they had the wind at their backs. So with a close action signal, although the British fleet was technically outnumbered, they could have bunched up together and borne down and taken out the French vanguard and middle before the aftmost French ships could come up to offer some assistance, at which point they would have had, the British that is, would have had local superiority in basically two separate engagements, and probably could have pulled off a fairly decisive win. So from that perspective, the fact that Graves hoists these conflicting signals, which nobody really understands, and means that the British ships kind of feed in gradually and are therefore usually getting the worst of it, then that speaks to Graves making the mistakes and perhaps that causing the loss of the battle. However, even with that said, the French under de Grasse they used their relatively normal tactics of shooting at the rigging of the enemy ships, but they did make very effective use of those tactics, which then exacerbated the British mistake, because if with the situation as it was, in theory, still having the wind advantage, the British fleet might still have been able to close in and eventually bring about a general action which might have been to the French disadvantage, except for the fact that because the French were repeatedly crippling and disabling the masts and rigging of various British vessels, not only was that slowing the arrival of other vessels because they were having to dodge around them, but it was also rendering some of the leading vessels pretty much incapable of continuing the action, which was thus reducing the pressure on the French vanguard and middle, which meant that they could stand firm. And then, of course, you have also the aftermath where de Grasse chose to, hold his ground and eventually effectively intimidate Graves into withdrawing. So whilst the British did make mistakes, those mistakes on their own wouldn't necessarily have cost them the battle, but the French capitalising on the British mistakes, which is a sign of good leadership and training for the French, because bear in mind this is still the French Royal or Imperial Navy, not the revolutionary one where they've executed most of their competent officer corps, it makes the battle as much a French victory, if not more so, than a British failure, if you like. So, I mean, there are obviously different opinions. You can read multiple accounts of the battle where some will say it's mostly the French's success, others will say it's mostly a British failure. Personally, I tend to go it's more of a sort of 50-50, maybe at worst a 60-40 between the two. Yokosuka, as apparently it's called, Yokosuka Girls Marine High School training vessel Harakaze asks, what were the last surface actions of the various Axis powers? For this I mean when battle was actually engaged, and includes Italy before they switched sides. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, technically their last surface engagement occurred after the war had ended, as there were a number of Japanese holdouts who either didn't get the message about the surrender or chose to ignore it anyway. So in the immediate aftermath of World War II, officially ending, a Japanese crewed junk, as in literally one of those Chinese sailing vessels, rocked up and attacked a US, well, not US manned, but it was a Chinese manned with US trainers aboard junk, and they engaged in a surface action that, I say, post-dates World War II. So technically that was the Imperial Japanese Navy's last surface action, even if it was also technically unauthorised. For the Kriegsmarine, the last recorded surface action was on the 18th of March 1945, which is known as the Battle of the Ligurian Sea, which actually took place in the northern Mediterranean between a pair of British destroyers and a German formation made up of a destroyer and two torpedo boats, which, ironically enough, both of the torpedo boats were ex-Italian vessels that the Germans had commandeered, and the destroyer also wasn't German. It was a Yugoslavian vessel that they'd also commandeered. Anyway, they ran into a pair of British destroyers and lost the engagement. The German-controlled destroyer was damaged and both of the torpedo boats were sunk in exchange for damage to one of the British ships. Now, with the Italian Navy, it's a little bit harder to tell, and I'm not entirely sure of this one, but the last major surface engagement I could find for the Italian Navy before the armistice at the beginning of September 1943 was an engagement in mid-July between the small cruiser Scipio Africano and some MTBs, which the Italian ship won, and is notable as being the only time the Italians successfully used their own radar in a night engagement in World War II. Now, there is obviously a fairly big gap between mid-July and the beginning of September, but during this time, that's when Mussolini was in the process of being overthrown, so it's perhaps understandable why there wasn't too much activity by the Regia Marina during this period. But if there was another Regia Marina surface action up after the mid-July and before the start of September 43, and someone knows about it, please let us know in the comments below. Dr. Irrelevant asks, Chapter 1, Article 18 of the Washington Naval Treaty prohibited the gift, sale, or transfer of any existing warships to a foreign power, resulting in the majority of the older capital ships being scrapped. I assume this was mostly to prevent Britain just gifting 13.5-inch armed battle squadrons to its dominions. If that article had been omitted from the final treaty, what would have been the likely fate of the scrapped ships? Would Canada and Australia have entered World War II with their own battle squadrons? Would the US have attempted to establish a Filipino navy based on its older dreadnoughts? Or would most of them have been scrapped in the interwar years regardless? I think for the most part, ships would still have been scrapped because most of the navies in question wouldn't really have had the funding to be able to do much with any large units, and to be certain there wouldn't be battle squadrons. Canada's government in the interwar period didn't seem particularly keen on them having much of a navy. They wanted a little bit, but given the amount of funding they were provided with, unless the entire thing was subsidised under kind of a nudge-nudge, wink-wink thing from Britain, which probably wasn't in a position to afford that kind of scale of subsidy, I don't think they would have had much in the way of capital ships, if anything. With the Filipino Navy, again, it would have to be very heavily subsidised by the US. That I can see maybe some of the older ships being, some of the older 12-inch gunships being foisted off on them as a kind of a mobile defensive coastal battery in lieu of fortifications, which obviously the Washington Treaty said they couldn't do anymore. So that is a potential option, somewhat more realistic than Canada ending up with its own battle squadron in the interwar period, but it would have to be very heavily subsidised by the US, which may start tripping over technical clauses of the treaty. Now, where it's most likely that there would be a capital ship or two is probably Australia, because Australia was determined to keep a relatively decent fleet for its size. They were a little bit ticked off, and understandably so, about having to scuttle HMAS Australia. So they might not, well, they're not going to have a battle squadron, but they might want to keep a flagship capital vessel. And for that purpose, you might well see HMS Tiger being sent over there, because Tiger was going to have to be disposed of along with the Iron Dukes at the end of the 1920s anyway. The Australians had basically only just gotten Australia back after the First World War, so they probably would have run her for a bit during the 20s, and then, you know, she would have been pushing on towards 20 years old at the end of that decade, at which point she would have either needed a major overhaul or scrapping, and at the same time the Royal Navy would have been treaty obligated to get rid of Tiger, so rather than do an expensive overhaul and partial modernisation of a ship that really was probably obsolete 10 years ago, in the case of Australia, the Australians might then just go, okay, well, let's have Tiger. The Royal Navy doesn't want it, it's a considerably more powerful vessel than Australia is, so let's rename it HMAS Australia, and, you know, we'll get rid of the old Australia, bring in Tiger as the new Australia, and maybe give it a workover and a modernisation in the early 1930s, and then entered World War II with that. So, of the three potential options, Canada, Australia, and a Filipino Navy, that's probably the strongest candidate. I think the Australians would rather have liked the idea of a modernised Tiger leading their counties and Leanders, and they may even, you know, have one less county in order to pay for the transfer of Tiger and its modernisation, because I have a feeling the British will probably just be happy to sell it for a notional pound or scrap value, and the Australians just take it and redo it because it adds overall to the British defence, realistically speaking. Jonathan Smith asks, thinking about World War II timed fuses for anti-aircraft fire, do you happen to know how tight the timing tolerance specification was on the time fuses? So when it comes to timed fuses, there are two types of timed fuses. You've got either a clockwork mechanism or a powder-based mechanism, where, or where basically there's a known burn rate of powder, so X amount of powder will burn in Y number of seconds. The clockwork one's fairly simple to work out. Now, I don't know precisely what the tolerances were, but when it comes to looking at the results, if you like, the most commonly quoted figures for timed fuses being fired at targets, and we're assuming, of course, that the range data was correct in the first place, but they usually talk about something like the shells exploding between 100 and 200 feet above or below the target, or that they, well, not that they always did, but they could, within the margin of error available on the fuses, explode in that gap. So if we average out what the velocity of the shells is likely to be at, let's say, 10,000 feet or so between a bunch of different anti-aircraft guns, and we then look at, okay, well, let's take the middle of the two figures, 150 foot, so that's a 300 foot margin of error, but it's plus minus 150 feet, and then we work out, well, the velocity in feet per second, 1 over that gives you what fraction of a second that shell needs to travel 1 foot, multiply it up by 150, and you get, depending on which average you're using, whether you're using the average of US 5-inch AA guns or the average of British 4.5 and 4.7-inch AA guns, etc., you usually wind up with a figure that would reflect somewhere in the region of a 5 to 7% margin of error, so plus or minus 5 to 7% on the quality control. And note that's 5 to 7%, and even if you wanted to round it up to 10% margin of error on detonating comparative to the second or fraction of a second you've actually set it to. So if you fired that shell with a flight time of 8 seconds, it's going to explode up to 7.9 to 8.1 seconds after you fired it. But if you fire it for a flight time of 20 seconds, roughly speaking, it's still going to explode 19.9 to 20.1 seconds after you fired it. That time margin isn't going to increase, or the distance margin isn't going to increase the further the shell goes. In fact, if anything, it's actually going to be slightly less, because obviously as the shell goes further, it slows down, which means that within that 5% to 10% of a second, which may represent the maximum tolerance within the fuse, it's not going to travel as far. So actually a longer distance variable time fuse is more likely to go off closer to where you want it to. The problem is, of course, at the longer distances, it's harder to compute and calculate the distance you actually want it to detonate at in the first place. MSSB asks, I've noticed that the 5.25-inch naval gun was designed in 1935 but not put into service until 1940, with a prototype installed on Iron Duke in 1939. So my question is, when and how long was the design development process, and when did production start? Any accompanying reference material would be appreciated. Also, do you have the design for the 5.25-inch armed destroyer in the question for Drydock 217 at 38 minutes 30 timestamp? So the two destroyer designs you're looking for are called L72 and L90, which doesn't help, because if you put L72 or L90 into most literature, you'll end up finding the destroyers that carry those pennant numbers. But nevertheless, the designs do exist. If you look for Norman Friedman's book on British destroyers and frigates from World War II and beyond, you'll find reference to it. So L72 and L90 were designed with a minimum armament of 4 twin 4.7-inch guns in weatherproof mountings, i.e. full gun houses, with 2 quadruple torpedo tubes, 2 quadruple pom-poms, and 2 of a new style of multiple machine gun, which is what they were coming up with at the time. L72 was... they both, by the way, would have had a power plant of 72,000 shaft horsepower, which is almost double what you'd find in a J class. So L72 was designed to be 2,745 tons standard, 420 foot long, and would make just over 39 knots at standard displacement. L90 was 475 feet long, displacing 3,205 tons, and would make 40 knots at standard displacement because of its greater length and length-to-beam ratio. And the discussion was, well, if our minimum is 4 twin 4.7 inch in fully enclosed gun houses, but perhaps as an alternative we can have 3 twin 5.25 Dido type mounts. Now, as far as the 5.25 inches development cycle, the book, let's have a look. The book Naval Anti-Aircraft Guns and Gunnery by Norman Friedman, sorry, I had to turn the cover page back over, that mentions, for example, on page 101, in 1935 a new 5.25 inch gun firing an 80-pound shell with a separate cartridge was proposed. Preliminary trials were successful, and the Director of Naval Ordnance reported that if further trials confirmed that, this gun would supersede the 4.5 inch. Trials having confirmed that the gun could fire separate anti-aircraft ammunition, a twin mounting was designed, and in 1936 it was scheduled for trials aboard Iron Duke in late 1937 or early in 1938, with both it and the 4.5 being used as dual-purpose capital ship secondary weapons. So that would suggest that the proposal in 1935 was followed relatively rapidly by the construction of prototype gun barrels, because they were conducting trials which confirmed some of the initial viability of the things. And if it's being scheduled in 1936 for trials on Iron Duke the following year, then that suggests that those initial trials had already been completed. So there was at least a 5.25 inch gun fully functioning, probably considerably more, by mid-1936. So based on the trials and the fact that both Dido and King George V were the first two ships to be equipped with a 5.25 inch gun, and they were launched in 1939, entered service in 1940, that would suggest that production of the 5.25 inch gun, when commensurate with the trials on Iron Duke in the late 1930s, that would suggest that production of the 5.25, full production that is, within the twin mountings and everything, is probably only commencing in late 1939, probably mid to late 1939, in order to have enough of them available for the initial Didos and King George V. Although, of course, there were production bottlenecks that meant that some of them went out without, some of the cruisers, that is, went out with without all their 5.25s. So that's going to be where their production starts. Rebel Skvirl asks, in the novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the Nautilus sinks its targets by ramming them. From an engineering perspective, could a submarine feasibly be designed and built to deliver such an attack without causing crippling or fatal damage to itself in the process? Theoretically, yes, but you're going to have to be very clever how you do it. And this kind of divides into two sections. You have the classic 19th century 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea Nautilus. Now, in those circumstances, it's somewhat easier to do, because the Nautilus is built out of metal, and its targets are generally going to be built out of wood, and they're not going to have anything in the shape of anti-torpedo defences or anything. So having some kind of ramming device, whether that be a ram bow, or, as in the cases you can see with the Disney Nautilus, a bunch of sawtooth teeth. Metal is obviously harder than wood, it's stronger than wood, so especially against merchant hulls, which aren't going to be particularly thick, if you ram a fairly solid metal submarine into the underside, bearing in mind that also you're not going to have the kind of sort of perpendicular impact and stick which caused a lot of problems for surface-based ramming. If you time it right, it's more going to be a glancing ram. Then you could probably pull that off. Of course, once you get into metal-framed ships with metal sides, whether that be iron or steel or whatever, you begin to run into problems, because if you do a more perpendicular ram, a ram into the ship's side, well, A, the hull plating is going to be relatively thick, and B, ships start in the iron and steel era. Well, in the iron era, you might well run into a deep riding armour belt, and in the steel era, you are likely to run into some form of anti-torpedo defences. So, you're going to stick the front of your sub into void and liquid spaces, which, I mean, okay, you've got enough inertia if you're moving at 30 knots to probably continue through into the bowels of the ship, but you're going to take an awful lot of damage in return. So kind of a move back towards this kind of over-mounted glancing ramming device would probably be better, because whilst most ships of World War I, World War II will have a double bottom, it's much easier to rip a big gash in the bottom of a ship than it is to try and go through the side with the anti-torpedo defences. And again, because you're not coming to a sudden screaming halt, you won't have as many problems with energy transfer. Now, when you get into the realms of, again, World War I, World War II submarines, the submarine does have one other advantage, which is that, of course, the submarine pressure hull is separate to the external hull. So if you have a cutting or ramming device mounted atop your mounted atop your outer hull, so you have that, and then whatever it is, your blades, your serrated edges, whatever you happen to be using, and then so you hit the ship, the device itself, whatever it is going to absorb a certain amount of that energy. Then that energy is going to be transmitted through to your outer hull casing, which again itself may deform, and then remaining energy will be transmitted through to your pressure hull. Your pressure hull is designed to take a lot of force anyway, so if you do it right, and you specifically design the sub for this, perhaps with an over-rigged pressure hull, lots of different attachment points, shock absorbers, etc., etc., you might be able to come up with a sub that has the ability to basically run underneath an enemy ship. Not entirely sure how you precisely control the depth, but there you go, and rip out the bottom of the ship. It's still going to massively shake up your sub, but potentially you could actually accomplish all of that without the overarching issue of we are sinking. It will be difficult to do, and if you misjudge the depth and plough headlong into the side of a ship, you probably will cripple yourself. But it is, at least in theory, possible. Not that I'd like to be on board when you tried it. Manani Wanderer asks, of all the ships named Enterprise from the period the channel covers, which ones would have had the most historical impact if they'd been Thanos snapped out of existence as soon as they disappeared over the horizon on their first voyage? Well, it's a relatively easy one. Obviously, it's USS Enterprise CV6, because if you look, well, even if you just look at the Enterprises in the US and Royal Navies, most of the time, surprisingly enough, for a ship with such an important record nowadays, the USS Enterprises that predate CV6 weren't really particularly large or important ships. Enterprise got her name because there was a USS Enterprise during the Revolutionary War, or the American War of Independence, or the American Revolution, depending on what you want to label it. But that was a historic callback. But that particular schooner didn't do a huge amount, and if she just popped out of existence one day, well, so be it. And pretty much the same thing with most of the other USS Enterprises before CV6. They're all relatively small craft that would be fairly quickly and easily replaced, and whose disappearance may not necessarily be considered too much of a big issue. And similarly with the HMS Enterprises. Now, granted, ironically enough, for nowadays, the average HMS Enterprise prior to the 20th century was actually a significantly larger, more capable vessel, usually something between a frigate and a heavy frigate in the Royal Navy, with a fair number of smaller vessels included as well. And then in the 20th century, of course, Enterprise is one of the two E-class cruisers. Now, if she'd disappeared, the cruiser this is, on her first voyage, that would have been more of a problem, because the E-class, until they started building the counties and so forth, and then later, obviously, the Leanders and Arethusas and Towns, the E-class were kind of the ultimate expression of the World War I British cruiser design style, at least as far as it related to what would become the light cruiser, the Hawkins, of course, being the prototype of a heavy cruiser. So that would have caused some consternation and some issues about where do we somehow get a modern replacement, albeit that the Washington Treaty would allow for the replacement of a cruiser that was lost. Whereas if CV6 disappears on her maiden voyage, you could replace her, and certainly there would be the time to replace her, but carriers take a lot longer to build than anything else that up till that point had been named Enterprise, which would have put the US Navy in something of a bind, because not only are they down one carrier for the late 30s, which means less opportunity to exercise and test squadrons and everything, but also a replacement Enterprise, even if they lay her down immediately, as well as costing a lot of money, is going to be entering service considerably later, and they're therefore going to be somewhat less experienced in terms of her flight crews, etc., and her general operating crew once war itself breaks out. Now, okay, Hornet did a reasonable enough job, except at Midway, for the most part, and she was a brand new, fresh off the line carrier at the start of World War II, but there is a gulf of difference between Hornet's performance, Hornet CV8, in World War II, and Enterprise CV6's performance, and the replacement Enterprise would sit somewhere between those two. Of course, the other thing you could argue potentially would be if the very first USS Enterprise had vanished on the first voyage after the Americans got their hands on her, then maybe she would have been in service for such a short amount of time, maybe there wouldn't be any further USS Enterprises. That would be a fairly big historical impact, albeit the ships themselves would still exist, they'd just be called something different. Sapper Ninja asks, back in July I asked about the question why build the Yorks. You mentioned in part of your answer that the Royal Navy thought a very capable 6-inch cruiser might be able to fight off a treaty 8-inch cruiser. So could a town, Crown Colony or Dido actually take on, or at least hold off, something like a Tone, Hipper or Zara, or how about a Deutschland? There's a huge number of variables to that. Now, a town I would give much better odds than a Crown Colony, because usually they came with 3 turrets instead of 4, so that's 25% drop in firepower. And a Dido, of course, still has fewer guns than a town, and they're 5.25, so slightly shorter range, slightly less firepower per gun anyway. But it also depends on numbers, and it depends on not just the numbers of ships on each side, but also which particular ships are on each side, and weather and range factor in as well. Because what might happen in a 1v1, so let's say generic 8-inch heavy cruiser comes across a 6-inch cruiser, so let's say a town class, because as I said, they're the ones with the best chance, and they both start engaging each other at 15 to 20,000 yards. Now at that point, yeah, I would definitely give the town class relatively decent odds on taking on the generic 8-inch cruiser, because they're both in range of each other. Statistically speaking, the town is going to have more guns and it's going to be chucking a lot more shells down range. However, what the target is in this 1v1 is going to make, as I said, a big difference. Something like a Japanese cruiser with its 1-inch thick turrets is going to be a lot more vulnerable to incoming fire as compared to something that's fairly well protected, like a Zara class. And of course we know that the 6-inch shells, whilst they did chew up the upper works of the Graf Spee, they weren't able to get quite the penetration at the range, at least at the ranges they were engaging, that Exeter's 8-inch guns could. So a town versus a Deutschland would be an interesting one. The thing is, the Deutschland would have quite a significant range advantage, and its shells definitely can get through pretty much any of the armour that's on the town. The town would have to rely on getting in closer and hoping just for suppression of fire control systems and other secondary systems in order to make the Deutschland break off. Of course, once you get close enough, even the 6-inch guns will go through Deutschland's protection. They weren't that well protected on the belt. But, so the heavier armoured 8-inch cruisers will have a better chance than some of the ones that sacrificed protection in certain areas. But as I said, it also comes down to the range that's involved, because at longer ranges, like 20,000 yards plus, the 8-inch cruiser is probably going to have the advantage because its guns can operate quite reliably at those kinds of ranges. The 6-inch, their armor-piercing capability at that range is fairly minimal. And then it also turns into a numbers game, because a 1v1 is one thing, whereas in a multiple cruiser engagement, and you actually do have examples of multiple 6-inch and 5.25-inch cruisers, which do include the occasional town like Gloucester, but mostly is Leanders, Didos, and the odd Arethusa, taking on 8-inch cruisers. That happens in the Mediterranean several times when the Trentos, etc., pop up fighting British cruiser units. And in those circumstances where you have multiple 8-inch cruisers versus multiple 6-inch cruisers, what tends to happen, at least in good daylight weather, is that the 8-inch cruisers comprehensively outrange the 6-inch cruisers, both in terms of effective and absolute, and that means that the British cruisers are then forced to fall back towards support. Now, occasionally, when these engagements happen, the 6-inch cruisers are able to close the distance, because of course you've also got to bear in mind who else it might be in the vicinity, and when they are able to close the distance, occasionally you do get straight up gunfights developing. But on a very broad basis, if you're taking the average British 6-inch cruiser, which is everything, I say, from an Arethusa or a Dido all the way up to a town, against the average 8-inch cruiser, in middling weather in a straight-up 1v1, it has a chance. If you have a town, or particularly Belfast or Edinburgh, taking on one of the slightly less well-protected 8-inch cruisers, like a Japanese generic one, and as well as some of the others, then the 6-inch cruiser probably definitely has an advantage in most circumstances. But if you take something like a Dido or an Arethusa and you put it up against something like a Deutschland or a Zara, then the balance 1v1 is going to be quite heavily in the favour of the heavy cruiser. And then see my comments on the Mediterranean for when you get groups of them. Richard Sue, I think, asks, how effective were the 12-inch guns of the Imperatrista Mariya Gangut class? In War Thunder, its semi-armor piercing shell evidently seems to be able to penetrate and detonate the magazines of much more advanced battleships like Hugo, Andrea Doria, Marlborough, Wyoming, and Kaiser. Were the 12-inch Russian guns truly this effective? Now, I suspect part of that is probably going to have to do with, I would suspect that everybody in War Thunder is probably engaging at considerably closer ranges than they would have engaged in straight-up battleship fights in World War One, which is going to obviously give the smaller guns effectively disproportionately better penetration. But nonetheless, the Russian 12-inch guns as found on those ships was a 52 caliber weapon. But what the Russians appear to have done is, rather than make their 52 caliber weapon basically a railgun, when you look at the projectile weights for the Russian gun and the muzzle velocity is not a huge amount to write home about. It's competitive towards the slightly higher end of comparative 12-inch guns in the German, American, and British navies. If you're looking at the latest 12-inch guns that those navies are bringing to bear, obviously it's considerably more powerful than the 45 caliber 12-inch guns that a lot of the ships have. But when you look at the 50 caliber weapons that are on the last generations of British, American, and German ships, they're only 2 calibers off the Russian ones, so unsurprisingly their muzzle velocities are all roughly competitive. However, the Russians have gone for a significantly heavier shell. Everybody else's shells are somewhere between 850 and 900 pounds. The Russian armor-piercing shell is over 1,000 pounds, which, bearing in mind at this scale, means that you're looking at like 10 to 15% heavier shells. So they're utilising that to get armour penetration figures that admittedly are at the top end just about of 12-inch weapons, last generation 12-inch weapons in World War One. But of course, with that 1,000-pound shell, that is going to carry over to having better armour penetration significantly further down the line at longer ranges. It's going to retain more of its energy. At which point, combine that with, so you've got a relatively high velocity, relatively heavy for its caliber shell, and by all accounts, this also led to the Russian battleships having pretty accurate gunnery in World War One. And then you combine all of that with the fact that in somewhere like War Thunder, as I said, people are probably engaging considerably closer than is otherwise advisable, and you will suddenly find that, those shells are going to start doing some pretty nasty damage, because at about 10 kilometres or so, you're going to be reliably punching through, 13, 14 inches of armour, assuming that both sides are roughly broadside to each other, which is going to be in excess of the armour protection of almost all of the ships that you just mentioned. So, next time everyone's having a look at this, those engagements, look at the range they're engaging at. And if it's under 10,000 metres, yeah, you're going to die. Unless you angle something ridiculous. Nicholas Rassar asks, in the D-Day video you mentioned the order for Warspite to fire 50 rounds of 15-inch rapid fire. I'm assuming that means 50 total rounds and not 50 rounds per barrel, because otherwise what postal code are you attempting to wipe off the map? Well, yes, also if you did 50 rounds per gun, that would be, a good chunk of Warspite's magazine capacity diminished by a single burst of firing. So yes, as far as I can tell, obviously looking further into the account for subsequent later videos, I'm pretty sure it means 50 rounds total from Warspite, which, bearing in mind that she doesn't have X-turret at D-Day because it's out of action following Fritz X bomb damage, you are looking at just over 8 full salvos, but obviously she's not necessarily firing full salvos all the time. So, let's slightly overdo it and say that's 9 salvos, because technically, 8 salvos and a partial salvo. So if they're ordering that as rapid fire, so we've got the range locked in and everything, assuming the crews really go for it, you're looking at under 5 minutes, because of course 1 round per minute is for each gun, so 1 salvo per minute is average for a sea battle. But if you've gone full rapid fire mode and your target's locked in because you have the range and it's not moving because it's a land target, well, then you can get up to the theoretical, full rapid fire rate of the 15-inch gun, which is roughly speaking about 2 rounds a minute. At which point, 8 and a bit salvos is going to be, 4 and a bit minutes. So about 4 minutes 30, you'd have those 50 rounds down. And, I severely doubt you want to be at the receiving end of 50 15-inch high explosive rounds in under 5 minutes. There isn't going to be that much left of that area. Especially since if you were going to be particularly evil, which of course I would be, then given that you have 3 operational twin turrets, if the crew could stand it, I would actually maybe stagger the firing. So have 1 turret, then time 10 seconds, then the next turret, time 10 seconds, then the third turret, by which point your first turret is only 10 seconds away from reloading and being able to fire again, which in theory would mean for some very, 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 very unfortunate Germans, for the next 4.5 to 5 minutes, you'd be on the receiving end of a pair of 15-inch high explosive shells once every 10 seconds, which I think would break most people. Nick Brodar asks, Ryan of Battleship New Jersey recently described closing the barn doors, in which an Iowa-class battleship turns both rudders inboard to effect a crash stop. Supposedly, this could stop the ship within its own length. Do you know of any other ships capable of this manoeuvre? Are there other methods of stopping a ship within its own length? I mean, yeah, there are plenty of ways of stopping a ship within its own length. One of the main ways is ramming things. That tends to stop you pretty quickly, especially if those objects are like land. Nonetheless, there are a few other ways. You've got the Lacoste system, which was a thing back in the early pre-dreadnought period, as you can see here, fetchingly fitted to USS Indiana. And yes, it is pretty much what it looks like. It's a pair of pop-up, or I guess pop-out at this point, panels which would flare out the side of the ship to act pretty much in the same way as turning your rudders inboard would. Big resistive surface slows your ship down very significantly. Now, other ships who so those would be 2 methods: either fit the Lacoste brake or ram yourself into an object. These days, of course, with variable pitch propellers or azimuth podded thrusters, you might also be able to try that way. I don't know whether those would stop a ship within its own length, but it would certainly slow you down pretty darn quick. But In terms of other ships capable of that manoeuvre, well, you have to find a ship that's got at least double rudders, because if you've got a single rudder or two rudders in line with each other, then if you put them over, all you're going to do is go around in a circle. So you have to have a ship with double rudders, and that ship would have to also have power. The rudders would have to be individually powered and individually directable, because if they're linked into exactly the same system, then if you turn them one way, they'll both go that way, and if you turn them the other way, they go the other way. You would have to have a completely separate way of turning the two rudders individually, which, to be honest, you probably should have anyway, and then you could, in theory, do the same thing. You might not have quite the same effect as you would with something like an Iowa class, because, of course, the Iowa class has skegs, which, combined with the rudders, would create a kind of a three-sided water tunnel with a mostly closed end, whereas a ship that doesn't have skegs, there's more opportunity for the water that's being stopped to flow around and thus have less effect. So yeah, there are going to be other ships that theoretically can do this. I'm not aware of any others that have tried. Of course, if you wanted to be really, really, really dramatic, you could fit an Iowa class with Lacoste braking systems on the side as well, at least a pair, and then do a barn on the door stop with the Lacoste brakes out as well, and see how quickly you can slow the ship down that way. But unfortunately, I don't think anyone's going to let you take an Iowa class up to 33 plus knots in the first place these days, let alone fit other braking systems to it and then try and bring the entire thing to a screaming, juddering halt. Simon Me asks, Roskill versus Marder, separate to factual accuracy, who do you think conveyed their ideas better? Well, obviously this is going to be hugely subjective because different people react in different ways to certain writing styles. Personally, I find Marder to be a lot more consistent and, generally speaking, slightly easier to follow. The way he builds up his case and his argument, if he's making an argumentative point, or the way that he writes when he's just doing regular history. But at times, Roskill conveys his ideas better than Marder, but Roskill is a bit more uneven. So if I was to pick up a book by Marder, I would have a set expectation of what the reading experience is going to be like, and I'm probably going to get that regardless of which of his books I pick up. Whereas with Roskill, occasionally you can pick up a book by him, and at least for my subjective reading experience, I'll be like, this is absolutely fantastic, it's really well expressed. But then you can pick up another book by him and just like, please get to the point, it's torture to my eyes. So Roskill's output is a little bit more uneven, but I would say at his peak, Roskill is slightly better than Marder. But if you want consistency, you want to go with Marder. And before we proceed any further, I'm also reminded that there is a little bit more to say on barn door stops, which was sent to me by someone who actually works in ship engineering and propulsion, so probably one of the best sources to have. So I will read from that. Barn door stops are an extreme type of emergency stop where the ship's twin rudders use those rudders to rapidly decelerate a ship in an emergency situation. Barn door stop, also known as closing the barn doors, is initiated by the rudders being simultaneously turned inwards, which massively increases the drag on the ship, and apparently appears to stop the ship within a few hundred yards. The Iowa-class battleships do have a written procedure for doing one of these stops, but as Ryan Spansky pointed out on his video, they don't know for 100% certain if that was ever actually attempted, although various veteran accounts indicate that it may have been attempted aboard USS Wisconsin and may have damaged the rudders and steering motors in the process. Whatever the truth of that test, such a manoeuvre would put a massive amount of strain on the rudder, the hydraulics, the steering motors, and the mountings for the rudder. Having completed your barn door stop, there is a decent chance you might find your rudders will no longer work properly, which, as Bismarck demonstrated, is not a situation you want to find yourself in when you are at sea. But of course, crash stops are still a thing where all ships, especially warships, need to be able to stop in emergency situations. But how you actually do that depends very much on your propulsion system. For all ships, though, the first thing in a crash stop is to close the throttles on your engines, and if you leave it at that, the ship will gently coast to a stop as the energy bleeds off. There's a lot of weight and mass inherent in a ship, hence a lot of inertia, and that combined with hulls which are designed specifically to minimise drag when going forward through the water will lead to a stopping distance that's measured in miles. So to stop the ship more quickly, the answer is to increase the drag, and one of the best ways of doing that is actually the propellers. When you cut the power on a ship running at full speed, the force of the water on the propellers will keep the shaft spinning at whatever the RPM for that particular ship at that particular speed is, which is known as windmilling. If you have the shafts stopped or spinning much slower than they should be for the given water flow, then the drag on the ship increases massively, which helps your ships to slow down. The problem is that at high speed, the force of the water on the propellers is putting an awful lot of energy into the shaft. So, roughly calculated, the shafts on an Iowa windmilling with the ship travelling at 30 knots would need about 100 megawatts of power to be able to put into the 4 shafts to stop them spinning. So 25 megawatts per shaft. To put that into context, if you had a town of 90,000 people in it and you built a power station to supply them with electricity, 100 megawatts is roughly the size of the power station you'd need to build. At least for European measures of electricity per use per person on average. Now, while ships normally do have shaft brakes, they're not really designed for that level of energy when you're stopping a ship in an emergency from high speed. If you did try to apply one to a shaft that was windmilling while it was at full speed, best case scenario, you'd have a giant sparking Catherine wheel in the middle of your engine room, and worst case, it rips itself from its mounting and fires bits of itself all around the engine room whilst the shaft continues to rotate. So it's much better to use the propulsion system itself to slow the shaft down if you can. The easy way to do that is on a ship with electrical propulsion, or I guess in our time period, turbo-electric drive. One of the most basic facts about electrical engineering is that a motor and a generator are exactly the same thing. The only difference is whether you're putting power in or whether you're taking power out, and what nature that power is. So once you cut the electrical power to the propulsion motor, the force of the water rushing past the propellers keeps the shaft spinning, and the propulsion motor now acts like a generator, generating its own electricity. In theory, this electricity could then be sent into the electrical system of the ship, but in practice it's generally just dumped into a bunch of really big resistors, which turn the kinetic energy from the shaft into heat. And as you're taking away energy, the propellers are spinning more slowly than they would be if they were just windmilling. That massively increases drag on the ship, slows the ship down much more quickly than it would otherwise. Once the speed has dropped low enough, you can start running the prop motors as motors again, but this time in reverse to bring the ship to a dead stop without tearing your shaft apart. And these days the whole process is computer controlled, but even in turbo-electric drive ships it's relatively straightforward if you have an experienced crew, as you just have to throw the right switches at the right times. And now these characteristics and the responsiveness of electrical propulsion motors mean that electrically propelled ships can be very agile, especially compared to other ships of their size. Now, with steam turbine ships, at least in the time period after turbines which could reverse at all had been invented, to do a crash stop, the engineers would shut off the steam supply to the forward blades and start applying steam pressure, high pressure, to the reversing blades. Again, that will cause the propeller to spin much more slowly than it would be if it was windmilling, and thus slowing the ship. As the ship slows down, the force of the water on the propellers reduces, and eventually the force of steam on the turbine blades will become greater than the force of the water on the ship's propellers, and so shaft and propeller will start to spin in reverse, thus stopping the ship. There are a few complications, though. When you initially apply high-pressure steam to the reversing blades, the turbine is spinning very fast in the opposite direction to the flow of the steam, which is going to cause turbulence and pressure spikes in your steam system. Now, if you have a really well-designed steam plant in really good condition, that's not much of a problem. However, if that's not the case, you have to be very careful, as you might damage the plant or cause the safety valves to lift, which would take away all your steam pressure and with it your ability to slow down quickly or do much of anything else with your power plant for a good long while. You might even damage the turbine blades themselves, which, well, just ask Hood what happened to one of her turbines when she was chasing Strasbourg after Merzel Kabir. If you have variable pitch propellers, especially ones with reversible propellers, then you can obviously just change the shape of the propellers to perform a crash stop, and this is regularly used to create ships which are very agile these days, obviously in the more modern time period. However, these aren't really used on large and fast warships built in the time frame of the Channel. And the same thing applies to the exotic propulsion systems that I mentioned in the previous response: azimuth thrusters, Voss Schneider propellers, pump jets, etc. Now, the expert in question continues to go on. I'm not aware of any other large and fast warships which could reputedly stop from full speed in their own length or perform something akin to a barn door stop using its rudders. Given the energies involved, it seems to be very difficult to achieve and the risk of causing damage seems very high. However, there is a less extreme equivalent, which in theory at least could be used in modern warships to execute a short-distance emergency stop. Many modern ships, including warships, have got active stabilizer fins installed, which are used to keep the ship more level in all sea states, the Invincible class carriers being one example. But these stabilizers can be used to deliberately impart a large roll on the ship in a mode called forced roll. This is very commonly done on sea trials to prove the ship's stability and recovery in a controlled manner, and has the bonus of showing exactly who was telling the truth when they said they never get seasick. However, the stabilizer deliberately imparting a large roll to the hull followed by an equally large roll in the opposite direction and so on causes a lot of drag and will soak up a lot of the ship's kinetic energy. Doing this along with simultaneously reversing the engines will help the ship slow down quickly in a crash stop situation, but at the cost of throwing any loose objects around the ship and leaving a few crewmen feeling decidedly the worse for wear. Matt Blom asks, I've heard tidbits here and there about difficulties with triple expansion engines encountered at high speed. What type of engineering and maintenance challenges were encountered by warships running triple expansion engines at maximum speed? Well, you can enjoy some footage from USS Olympia's engine room, which you'll have seen in the USS Olympia video, whilst I talk about triple expansion engines, because obviously here are some warship triple expansion engines. Now, the main problems with the engineering and maintenance of warships when they're running their triple expansions at maximum speed, well, it falls into two main categories. First of which is kinetic issues, i.e. vibration, because as you can see, you've got these huge shafts which are going up and down, and technically speaking on the cams round and round. So there's a lot of vertical force involved with the VTEs. Now, because there's a lot of mass and a lot of force, that's going to lead to vibration, which can adversely affect the ship. And if the ship's going at high speed, then those things are going to be absolutely flying, which obviously is, vibration's not good generally for ships, but especially if you want stable gun platforms. If the midships is vibrating horrifically, that's going to really throw off your rangefinders and so forth. The other problem is that because there is a lot more of this, there's a lot more motion generally as compared to turbines, which just tend to spin on their axis while they're generating power. There is a lot, and the seal is not perfect on most VTEs. You end up with a lot of lubricant, which is grease and so forth, which is needed to stop the metal from grinding on metal, being squirted around everywhere, and a mixture of hot water and steam being squirted around anywhere and everywhere within the engine room, to a point where various period accounts talk about that when a vertical triple expansion engine is running full tilt, then not only does the interior of the engine room turn into something of a sauna with occasional squirts of boiling water, but also you've got all the lubricant that's being thrown around, all the grease flying around, which obviously makes things slippery, makes things hard to hold on to. The whole combination makes things hard to see as well, none of which is particularly good. And a lot of the crew describe operating in those environments basically wearing their storm gear, oil skins and other full body protection, just so that they're not immediately coated in hot water and oil themselves, and grease and so on and so forth. And of course, if all the lubricant that's been applied to the engines is being chucked out, along with a reasonable amount of the purified water that's being used in the system, then eventually, unless you start to admit untested water, or you have a lot of salt water and so forth, or you have a lot of reserve feed water which you're then going to have to heat up, you'll eventually start to lose steam pressure, and perhaps more importantly, you will very soon start to run low on your grease and other lubricants, which means you're going to have to try and top them up, which means you're going to have to try and top up your lubricant levels whilst the engines are going full tilt, whilst you're in a grease and steam-filled sauna room whilst you're dressed in out-weather gear and everything is incredibly slippery, which is, of course, going to be very, very difficult, assuming, of course, that you even can top up or reinstate some of the grease and other lubricants, because, of course, if the engines are going full force, you might not be able to, because those lubricants might be under so much pressure. If you open up the cap to refill them, you're just going to end up with another bunch of hot lubricant squirted in your face and even more friction problems. So that's going to be all, massive, massive problems that you're going to have long-term running VTEs at full tilt, let alone the vibration issues. And this is in combination, never mind if your engineering crew can put up with those conditions for long enough, this is in combination why vertical triple expansion engines aboard warships could only be run for a certain amount of time before you just have to slow down. Now, towards the end of their use in warships, generally in the interwar period, you do get a thing called forced lubrication, which does help, at least in terms of making sure you don't grind your engines into a pile of useless scrap metal. But most of the other issues still do apply. Fluffy Goat asks, how much fishing was done on Age of Sail ships? Was fish used regularly to supplement ship stores, or was it a special treat if served at all? I mean, obviously it depends where you are and what the weather conditions are. Are you expecting contact with the enemy, etc., etc., etc.? Plus also, if you are moving, it's somewhat more difficult to fish off of a ship because, generally moving fishing is harder, but also, on a warship, even an Age of Sail warship, you're going to be relatively high up, and usually you have duties to attend to. But with all that said, fishing aboard Age of Sail ships was relatively common in the hull. So if you're on blockade duty, on intense lookout for incoming or outgoing enemy warships, you're not going to be doing a whole lot of fishing. But if you're on a gentle, leisurely cruise across the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, or you're in harbour for whatever reason, basically you're in a slightly more relaxed environment, then the crew would relatively regularly turn to fishing to supplement their diet. Now, obviously, that does lead to issues of, if one part of the crew is off duty at a particular time and the rest of the crew is on duty or resting, and that happens to be the really good fishing time, and they get a bunch of fish and the others don't, that could lead to tensions and issues within the ship. So usually, if there was going to be fishing, it would usually be an organised thing where authorization would be given and a large number of the crew would start to fish, and then the fish could be somewhat vaguely equally divided up between people. Of course, there will be small-scale fishing, as I said, going on to supplement individual messes and so forth, but it would tend to be either very small-scale or actually relatively large and organised, not a tremendous amount in between. And you also have to remember it's also highly dependent on location. If you're in harbour or other coastal littoral waters, there's a much, much, much higher chance of you putting a fishing line or several down and coming up with a decent amount of success, as opposed to just randomly in the deep ocean where you may not find much of anything. Rodney McCoy asks, what would the repercussions have been if the Russians had defeated the Japanese at Tsushima? Would it be a dramatic rewriting of history as we know it? Well, a lot of it depends on how the defeat goes. Is it a complete and utter defeat? Is it both sides are very battered, the Japanese just come off a little bit worse? Is it, obviously the Japanese objective is to stop Rozhestvensky. Does Rozhestvensky make it through in some way, shape or form? What's the scale of the defeat in the first place? But also, how does it happen? If we assume it's a relatively decisive defeat of the Japanese, then there are a number of ways it could happen. It could be that maybe Rozhestvensky was able to get the formation sailing and changing of formation of his fleet up to a little bit of a better standard. It could be that perhaps the Russians have better working shells, because Togo did make what would otherwise be a relatively inadvisable maneuver of doing a 180 in front of Rozhestvensky's fleet. Now, if the Russian gun, like, as completely aside from whether or not the Russian fleet was in formation at that point, had the Russian gunnery been provided with better shells, because their actual shooting wasn't too bad, it's entirely possible that Togo's fleet might have been crippled and then destroyed at that point. So it could be any number of things. If it comes down to something like that, so the Russians get their whole hands on some of the latest and greatest armor-piercing shells, and they savage Togo's fleet as it does that 180, then it will probably be just remembered as Admiral Togo kind of had the advantage, but then he threw it away by making a stupid maneuver. So that's a tactical reason for the loss as opposed to a strategic one. And the repercussions at that point, on a large scale, probably won't be that much, because people will still be able to otherwise analyze the capabilities of the various ships. And obviously the Dreadnought era is coming in very quickly anyway, which is going to negate a reasonable amount of what you might otherwise learn about ship construction at Tsushima. You're still going to have the lessons of, longer range gunfire than everybody thought was reasonable coming out of it. But if Japan loses the Russo-Japanese War, well, I mean, this is the thing. It depends. Does Japan lose the Russo-Japanese War? Just because it loses at Tsushima, if enough of the Japanese fleet survives and enough of the Russian fleet is damaged or sunk, that Rossisvensky gets the technical victory and then gets into Port Arthur. Well, if enough of the Japanese fleet exists to bottle them up in Port Arthur, the Japanese will still win the Russo-Japanese War, just not in quite as glorious a style. Whereas if it's a complete wipeout or near enough for the Japanese, and now Rossisvensky's fleet is able to join up with what's left of the Russian forces in Port Arthur and nearby, and now they control the local oceans, and they can cut off the Japanese supplies for the campaign, well, then Russia wins the Russo-Japanese War. Now, what impact is that going to have on Japan? On the one hand, mainland Japan is not going to be threatened. On the other hand, their fleet has been reset back to 0. But, again, while this will be a notch to Japanese prestige and possibly strengthen the case of the Japanese army in the long term, you still have the fact that the Dreadnought era is coming in, and to a certain extent that's going to act as a reset regardless of who wins or loses. So, at extreme interpretations, yes, it could lead to quite a different history, especially if Russia becomes a lot more invested in trying to take Pacific coast-based holdings. But on the other hand, it could just be, well, that war ended a little bit differently, but overall the timeline goes on as pretty much expected. Lofferton Henderson asks, can you explain the armour layout of certain Treaty-era cruisers that apparently had boxes around the magazines and machinery rather than traditional belts, like, say, the Leander class? What does that mean in practice, and how does it differ from the traditional belt and bulkhead cruiser armour schemes? Did any ships use both a box and a belt, and would you say the box armour scheme was successful? So the box armour scheme was used in a number of British cruiser designs in an attempt to square the circle that was Treaty-era heavy cruiser design. The fundamental problem with Treaty-era heavy cruisers, which is something we've touched on before, is that to maintain the sort of 32, 33 knot minimum speed that was felt necessary, plus long range, plus aircraft facilities, plus at least 8 8-inch guns for full-sized cruisers, the Yorks aside. All of these were kind of your minimum requirements, and if you could get 9 or 10 guns, then even better, and so on and so forth, more aircraft handling facilities. But you rapidly ran into the problem that on 10,000 tons, especially once anti-aircraft weapons came into the mix, there just wasn't enough weight for armour. And if you did a full belt, then you had to sacrifice other things, which, as I said, you've established these are minimums you can't go below. Now, the problem with the belt armour was, of course, that you had to have a belt that was somewhat effective against similar shells, i.e. 8-inch shells, at the ranges you expected to fight, which is actually a fairly big ask. And there basically just wasn't the weight, so you could either cheat, or if you didn't cheat, or you were being a bit creative, then you could look at something like box armour. So at that point, you were making sacrifices. So what the British ended up doing was going, right, okay, we can't protect our traditional citadel, i.e. the magazines, the machinery, and the space between them with a belt that will resist 8-inch gunfire. So if we can't do that, what can we do? And they came to the conclusion that, well, obviously, if a shell hits the magazines, it's game over for the ship. So the magazines must be protected by 4 or 4.5-inch armour. Once we've established that we must do this, we only have a limited amount of weight left around to play with. Now, exactly what the box layout was varied between ships, but essentially what they did is they went, okay, well, the machinery spaces, the engines and boilers that need to be protected, they don't start at the back of the forward magazines, and they don't finish right in front of the aftmost magazines in most cases. There is space in between. So what we will do is we'll put a limited thickness belt that just protects the machinery spaces themselves, and that could be 1 or 2 inches, usually 2 inches, because 1 inch is basically negligible. So around about 2 inches or so. So halving or more the weight of that particular section. You then don't have armour, apart from the ship's hull, between the end of that and the start of the box on either end, and obviously that distance could vary or may not exist at all depending on the ship design in question, and also whether it's fore or aft. So that's saving weight. Then you have your heavy armour over the magazines, but this leaves you with a rather significant weakness, which is that obviously you would have, even in a normal citadel scheme, you'd have bulkheads at either end because shells can come in through the bow and stern. But in a box scheme, you also have these spaces between the machinery and the armour boxes, and in those spaces, a shell that's coming at an angle could also get in and either flood the machinery spaces or blow up the magazines. So you have to have additional bulkheads going in laterally within the ship. Now, of course, this adds some of the weight that you've just saved back into the ship design, which is not ideal, but it's better than the thing blowing up. But because any such shell is going to have to have come through at least some hull plating and some decks, etc., that shell will have lost some energy, so you don't have to make that bulkhead quite as thick as the sides of the box. So you might have, say, a 4-inch side to the box and a 3-inch bulkhead. And you'd have some kind of bulkhead for the machinery, which is rated similarly, a slightly reduced version of what the belt on the machinery is rated for. Now, as we said, the machinery belt is not going to be capable of stopping an 8-inch shell at expected combat ranges, but what it can do, depending on its thickness, is stop either destroyer gunfire or maybe in some of them 6-inch cruiser gunfire, again, depending on the exact scheme. And so you're accepting that if you end up in a fight with an 8-inch cruiser, you are going to have your machinery spaces vulnerable to penetration, but your magazines won't be. So you might be crippled, but you won't be instantly destroyed. And in exchange, you're getting the range, the speed, the firepower, the aircraft, the anti-aircraft weaponry, etc., which hopefully should give you an advantage against an enemy ship that shows up with a full-length belt, but assuming they've stuck to the treaty limits, has had to make sacrifices elsewhere. Now, whether or not that works or is successful, it's successful-ish in as much as it meant that the magazines of British cruisers were protected against light gunfire, and they stayed underweight. Was it an ideal solution or better than the belt? No, because it was somewhat inefficient because you had all these additional bulkheads. It left machinery spaces considerably more vulnerable, and it meant obviously a greater proportion of the ship's side was also vulnerable to splinter damage and shock damage from near misses and so forth. And at some point, you would also end up with cases of where the box solution might actually end up weighing more than the belted solution, because if the gap between the machinery and the magazine armour was relatively small, and or you'd upped the machinery space armour to, say, withstand 6-inch gunfire, then adding in the weight of the bulkheads, you'd actually find you would save weight by eliminating those bulkheads and putting that weight into just joining up the two sections of armour, plus maybe beefing up the armour just a fraction more. And that, for example, is what happened when they were looking at HMS Belfast. There was a consideration, at least for the forward magazines, to have box armour, but they realised that actually box armour on a ship the size of Belfast with the layout and the machinery protection they'd agreed on would end up with the armour actually weighing more than a conventional belted scheme. So if you can afford it displacement-wise, the belted Citadel is the better way to go. But if you're on a very, very restricted amount of displacement, then a properly executed box is one of the better options in terms of choosing the lesser of several different evils. And then, of course, you also have the fact that I still maintain, to a reasonable degree of certainty, although, again, I still haven't managed to dig up the precise documentation that would prove it, I still maintain that somebody, when they were designing the counties, sat down and designed them ostensibly with boxes, but fitted them for but not with belts. Because, well, here's a picture of HMS Norfolk, and as you can see, she's riding a little bit high. And this is one of the things you see a lot in pre-war county class photos. Ostensibly, they are up to 10,000 tons. They're ostensibly armoured, etc., perfectly within that. But an awful lot of pre-war, pre-refit counties ride a few feet higher than they, if you look at contemporaries like a New Orleans or a Northampton or a Mioka. They're always riding that just that little bit high. And then they get refitted with full-length belts. And suddenly they're riding normally. When, if those are really post-haste refits that weren't designed for in the original ship's design, they should be riding deep. But there you go. That's my little naval conspiracy theory. Primarch 359 asks, could you talk about the Tiny Tim rockets? Please explain, or perhaps explain, the doctrine and intended method of employment of these rockets in the anti-ship role. Were they meant to be a sort of aerial torpedo, or would they be employed from a higher altitude, or would it be the third leg of a high-low attack, and would it replace one of the components? The Tiny Tim came about essentially in response to increasing levels of anti-aircraft defence, and, you know, even with the Japanese Navy, if they put enough 25mm guns on the ship, there was enough ammunition in the air that something might get hit. And of course, you know, facing off against German air defences and looking forward to, you know, other air defences they might run into in the future, they realised that you had this kind of combination going of fighters going in strafing, dive bombers, obviously doing dive bombing, and then torpedo bombers. Now, with the torpedo bombers, with the addition of fins and various other things to the Mark 13 torpedoes, they'd managed to get the Avengers able to launch their torpedoes from much further out and at much higher speeds. Now, that didn't remove the Avengers from being attacked by long-range anti-aircraft guns, the dual-purpose type mounts, but it did, to a relatively large extent, eliminate most of the risk from the light to medium anti-aircraft fire. Not all of it, but a good chunk of it. An Avenger could drop its torpedo and turn away before it entered optimal range of most light to medium anti-aircraft guns. The problem was that fighters had to, if they wanted to take part in an attack, either had to go in and strafe with guns and/or cannon, or go in with very short-range rockets, either of which involved entering that much more lethal medium to light anti-aircraft gunfire range. The optimal range, that is, not the maximum. And with the dive bombers, of course, they could start their dive from however high up they liked, but there was an ideal release altitude, which again was within the optimal range of light to medium AA. So if you were facing off against particularly dedicated anti-aircraft defences, your dive bombers and your fighters, especially considering that fighters and dive bombers were kind of merging towards the end of the war into one kind of unified attack profile, these would be at much greater risk. And so the idea came about, well, if we build a bigger rocket, we can fire this rocket from further away, which means that our non-torpedo carrying attack aircraft, particularly our fighters and fighter bombers, will be able to engage enemy ships without getting swatted in large numbers by unseemly amounts of light to medium anti-aircraft fire. And so the Tiny Tim was developed, which essentially is a 500-pound bomb on the end of a rocket motor. It's not exactly a particularly high-concept weapon, but nonetheless probably fairly effective. And that's basically the idea. It allows you to deliver a 500-pound semi-armor piercing or armor piercing bomb at very high speed, which, would be similar to a dive bomber, but without having to get in range of the close-range anti-aircraft defences. Of course, it's not a 1,000-pound bomb, which the Helldiver or the Dauntless might deliver in a dive, or even a 1,600-pound bomb like Fairy Barracudas might be doing at this stage in the war. But on the other hand, it will be going a bit faster because it's powered by a rocket, and it's also going to be slamming in to the ship from an angle which is very different from a dive bomb. So it's not necessarily going to go under the deck, but it's going to hit in a different way and potentially penetrate into different portions of the ship. So yeah, it wasn't actually supposed to be a replacement for the torpedo. It was supposed to be for the non-torpedo carrying aircraft, although Avengers could also carry them. And in terms of altitude, it was a relatively low altitude release weapon because you had to not necessarily fly straight and level, but you had to fly at a relatively low altitude and then take aim to loose the rockets. And of course, unlike other rockets, you could only carry a few of these things. So you do have to, take a bit more of a careful aim. You can't do a kind of, we aim slightly low, start ripple firing, and then pull up, which you could do with, say, 3-inch rockets. And then, of course, the US Navy being the US Navy, not only equipped Tiny Tims on its aircraft, they also invented basically MLRS launchers, which they attached to PT boats, and a rather nifty thing that looks kind of like a blast-shielded variant of a twin-arm launcher that you'd see more often in Cold War surface-to-air missiles, to presumably enable a magazine of Tiny Tims to be fired from the deck of a ship, which presumably has gotten to disturbingly close range. But there you go, I guess it's a way of giving small ships a very, very, very large punch, disproportionate to their overall size. Donovan Lawler asks, from what I understand, pyrrhic victories are mostly a land affair. Can you give some naval examples within the time range that the channel covers? So one of the examples would be the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands, because technically speaking on paper, the Japanese do better than the Americans. The Americans have more ships damaged and they lose Hornet. So, in terms of ships go in, ships come out, the Japanese win, but some of their own ships are damaged and their air groups are utterly devastated. Similarly, you could look at Coral Sea as an American Pyrrhic victory in that, they managed to stop the Japanese, so great, fantastic. The Japanese aren't going to continue their expansion plans further south. On the other hand, in terms of the balance of losses, the Japanese kind of did get away with inflicting significantly more casualties because they managed to kill Lexington and damage Yorktown, whereas they only lost Shoho, which was relatively small. So in both of those cases, the overall number of losses on paper favoured the Japanese, but their objective was denied to them. So in both cases, you would count them as an American victory, but a very Pyrrhic one. And that's basically because unless something is very, very time sensitive, an opponent who loses in such a manner can just come back and try again, and eventually, if you're taking greater losses, you're just going to run out of, in this case, ships. You could also look at some operations. There may not necessarily be particularly a single battle, but the Channel Dash could be viewed as a Pyrrhic victory for the Germans, and that they succeeded in getting the Scharnhorst and Prinz Eugen through the Channel, and they shot down a fair number of British aircraft, etc. in doing so. On the other hand, the amount of mine damage that the two ships took would mean that, and the fact that they're now in Germany, meant that the threat of the Scharnhorst from immediately raiding the Atlantic was gone, and the threat of Gneisenau at all was gone for quite a while, and as it turned out, that would be permanent, and Scharnhorst herself would be out of action for quite a while as well. So, you've succeeded in doing what you ostensibly set out to do, but the overall implications for what your ships are then able to do in the future is quite reduced. And on a broader scale still, the Norwegian campaign. The Germans managed to take Norway. The Kriegsmarine facilitates that. But the number of ships that don't come back, everything from Blücher to Köln to half of their destroyers, and even more ships that are badly damaged, it massively sets back the Kriegsmarine's ability to do much of anything other than occasional surface raiding in the Atlantic for a good time to come, and in some cases affects Kriegsmarine tactical doctrine for the rest of the war. So that's a kind of a pyrrhic operational victory, I guess. And on the British side, something like Operation Pedestal could be seen as a pyrrhic victory, because on the one hand, yes, you managed to get just enough supplies through to Malta to allow the Maltese resistance against the Italians and the Germans to continue, but at the cost of 2 cruisers, an aircraft carrier and a destroyer, plus a good chunk of fairly valuable, high-capacity, relatively swift merchant ships, and almost exactly the same again, at least in terms of warships, badly damaged and taken offline. So, you can't do that kind of operation and take those kind of losses for sort of a just about acceptable result all that often before, again, you'd start running out of ships. And Dr. D.M. Platt asks, do you feel it's fair that battle honours are only given for British victories, or should any significant combat action count, such as Coronel? I personally think the system is largely fair, because battle honours are effectively kind of like medals for ships, and obviously they started off in the army, where again they're kind of like medals or awards for regiments. So whereas an individual soldier, if he, or I guess these days she, fights on a particular campaign or battle, then quite often you might get something commemorating that. So you have the North Africa Star, now the Arctic Convoy Star, the Battle of Britain Star, etc., etc., just citing World War II examples. And if you perform some particular feat of heroism, you might also get something like a Distinguished Service Order, or in the RF, Distinguished Flying Cross, or even a Victoria Cross, although they do tend to have a rather high posthumous rate, those last ones. But the key element to all of those is success. And even a Victoria Cross, even if you die, this is still on a personal level, if you get the Victoria Cross for having accomplished something, even if it's at the cost of your own life. Now, if you just lose, then, well, if you're on a soldier level, you just tend to die. So outside of the aforementioned, posthumous awards for bravery, you don't generally get recognised for that. But for ships, when you extend that sort of principle to ships, if they take part in a successful campaign or a successful battle or a successful action against a single ship where they destroy a particularly notable enemy ship or they capture a particularly notable enemy vessel, then they get a battle honour. So in this example, as you can see, this includes 2 lowercase character actions, Rivoli and Bismarck. So that's actions against a specific ship. This is the battle on board HMS Victorious, in case anyone was wondering. And then you've got various campaigns or larger scale battles, etc., which have been granted battle honours. So essentially, from a perspective of these are the equivalent for ships as medals are for individual soldiers or sailors, then I think it's fair that unsuccessful combat actions don't get a battle honour, albeit perhaps there's something to be said for if a ship goes down valiantly, perhaps covering the escape of other ships, then even if the battle is lost, that maybe should merit something akin to a ship's version of a Victoria Cross, which might be awarded for loss in the face of the enemy, but with great valor. So something like Glowworm might be eligible for something like that. Matt Kidd asks, how much more capable were purpose-built anti-submarine warfare escorts like US destroyer escorts compared to stopgaps like the Flowers once the Flowers had been refitted with the latest and greatest anti-submarine warfare systems? Considerably more capable, but with a couple of big caveats. Now, the biggest caveat is that your average destroyer escort, if we take the Buckley class as an example, because they're the single largest class numerically of destroyer escort, they're almost twice the displacement of a Flower class. So anything that is an anti-sub escort at that point should be more capable, even if it's a stopgap, because it's twice the displacement. It can carry a lot more stuff than a Flower. So even a double-sized Flower would obviously be more capable than a normal-sized Flower. Now, that's one thing to take into account. So comparing destroyer escorts to Flowers is not necessarily a like-for-like comparison, because a destroyer escort typically, even the smallest ones are still at least a few hundred tons heavier than Flower class, and the biggest ones are, I say, considerably larger. Now, with all of that said, when you look at where the benefits therefore come in, a lot of the benefits of a destroyer escort come in the form of more range, because obviously they can get more fuel in. But if you're running Atlantic convoy escort duty, as long as you can get to and from with action against subs, it doesn't matter as much. Although, of course, destroyer escorts see a lot of service in the Pacific, where that extra range does matter. They also have considerably better anti-aircraft and or surface gun capability. Again, because they're larger, they can support more weapons. So your typical destroyer escort has several 3-inch guns, which are dual purpose, and a bunch of 20mm and 40mm guns, whereas most Flowers would have a single 4-inch and then maybe a single 40mm pom-pom and a couple of Orlikans. So if the convoy comes under air attack, a destroyer escort is much better able to protect itself and its convoy. Now in terms of the actual anti-submarine duties, a refitted Flower has sonar, it's got depth charge launchers, it's got depth charge rails, and it's got a Hedgehog launcher. And destroyer escort has some depth charges with launchers and rails, and a Hedgehog mortar. So actually, and obviously sonar. So in terms of direct capability of chucking stuff at submarines to make them die, a destroyer escort isn't actually all that much more effective than a Flower class. It might, depending on the destroyer escort, carry a few more depth charges, but you'd be surprised on just how many depth charges you can fit on a Flower if you're really determined. Of course, the destroyer escort will have torpedoes as well, which gives it, for an anti-sub escort, bizarrely a anti-capital ship punch, which a Flower definitely doesn't have. But again, that's not related to anti-submarine warfare. But if there was one thing that a destroyer escort has that a Flower class doesn't, that is a marked increase in its effectiveness as an anti-submarine warfare vessel, as opposed to a general escort vessel, it's speed. Because a Flower class can do 15-16 knots all out, which has a number of limitations. One, some U-boats can outrun you on the surface. And two, even if you can overhaul them, it's going to be a very slow overhauling, and you're not massively faster than the convoy itself, which means that you can't afford to get distracted and drawn too far away from the convoy, because even if you could catch the U-boat, you might find yourself so out of position that you leave the convoy vulnerable for a very, very long time if you can catch up at all. Whereas a destroyer escort, typically capable of doing 24 to 25 knots, not only can chase down submarines a lot faster, thus giving them less time to react, but can also catch pretty much any submarine that it's likely to come across on the surface, and will be able to go out further to engage a U-boat or Japanese sub and come back again to the convoy with a minimal amount of exposure to the convoy as compared to a Flower. So Destroyer escorts, lots and lots and lots of additional advantages from the generic escorting role, but in anti-submarine warfare specifically, the speed is their single biggest trump card. October Nid asks, Abraham Lincoln had a maritime patent, the only president to have a patent. How long did his patent see use, and did any other historical political leaders contribute to naval or maritime technology in this way? So unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, nobody actually built Lincoln's system. And for those of you who are curious, this was a system to help boats that were stuck on mudflats or on rocks or in shoals or whatever. And the idea is effectively, if you like, a life preserver or flotation armband except for boats. The general idea being that obviously if you run around, the problem is caused by you having a deeper draft than the water around you. So then you inflate these pre-installed buoyancy chambers on either side of the boat, which then will grant you more buoyancy and a shallower draft, and then you will presumably come off of whatever you've got stuck on and can continue on your merry way. But as I said, as far as I'm aware, no one actually used it. The patent was granted, and that was kind of it. As far as other historical political leaders contributing to naval or maritime technology in such a way, I suppose it would be easy to cheat and point out that, especially in, say, the UK Parliament, there were a fair number of admirals who dipped in and out of political careers, and therefore stuff that they developed whilst they were in the Navy or shortly thereafter would technically count, because obviously Lincoln didn't get this patent whilst he was president. He got this patent earlier while he was a congressman. So using the same principle, you could say, yes, well, such and such an admiral, like Vernon or something, if they invented something and then later on entered political office, would that count? Yes or no? But as viewers of the channel have probably surmised by now, I'm not necessarily especially fond of politicians generally, so I don't tend to follow their careers particularly much, and therefore outside of pointing to a few examples of naval technology that were invented by naval officers who happened to also have political careers, I'm afraid I would be a little bit stuck in terms of coming up with other politicians who did something useful for anyone, really, let alone naval or maritime technology. Leon Wu asks, how do World War II folding wings on carrier aircraft work? On every picture of them, I don't see any identifiable strong, robust locking mechanism to keep the wings from folding back. What's their secret? Well, enjoy this footage of me hand pumping the folding wings on a Sea Fury while we work. Now, nonetheless, World War II folding wings on carrier aircraft, they work in numerous different ways, because you have upwards folding wings, which is what you're seeing at the moment on screen. You have backwards folding wings, like on a swordfish, and then you have the more esoteric ones, like the folding wings on a fulmar or the folding wings on a wildcat, for example. And each of those mechanisms works differently and will have different effects on how it stays locked back. Now, on some of the more advanced aircraft, there are hydraulic locking pins at either end of travel that will keep the wing in place. In the case of a swordfish, it is a simple hand lever which then locks a pin in. So if that handle flies up in mid-flight, your wing will fold back. That's not brilliant. This Sea Fury, by the way, does actually have a powered wing folding, but for the purposes of this demonstration, we were using the manual backup, which meant I'm inside the cockpit there, desperately pumping away. And if you watch Military Aviation History's channel, you'll have seen him doing pretty much the same thing. And there is another aspect which you're just about to see. That wing has just passed the point of gravity, and now I'm not pumping it, it's just coming down on its own weight, and there's the whole thing vibrating. So, these wings do weigh a fair old bit, which means that if you have wings that fold over like this, once they get past a certain point, their own weight will keep them locked in the stowed position just as much as, well, anything else, really. Now, obviously, if the ship is rolling a lot, like, say, Typhoon Cobra a lot, then you are going to have problems and those wings might start to unfold. But that's what tie downs are for. That's why the reason why you would also have hydraulic systems, because obviously these have been even though they're hand cranked, it is a hydraulic system, so hydraulic pressure will also keep them in place. But unfortunately, there is no one single how do World War II folding wings work, because it could be gravity, it could be lines, it could be a manual locking bolt, it could be a hydraulic locking bolt, it could be pressure in hydraulic lines that's not technically a locking bolt but has the same effect. All depends very much on the aircraft in question. And here goes the other wing over, because, yeah, there's no way you're hand cranking both wings up at the same time. And boom, there you go. Look forward to a video on the Sea Fury at some point. Andrew Waite asks, in hindsight, would a King George V with just 8 14-inch guns in 2 quad mountings forward make for a good proposition? The Royal Navy tended to engage enemy capital ships 2v1, and 2 8-gun King George V's would easily outgun a single European capital ship. Duke of York would have had 8 instead of 6 heavy guns able to fire forward with which to pursue Scharnhorst at the Battle of North Cape, and shorter propeller shafts might have helped Prince of Wales, as deleting Y turret when she was torpedoed would mean there's either less chance of flooding or less flooding. The weight that was then saved could be spent on more armour, bigger engines, or just on smaller and cheaper ships. So you might end up with something vaguely looking like this. It's not perfect, but it's the best I could come up with at short notice in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts. I'm assuming in this case that aircraft handling facilities would be mounted astern because, well, when you use a KGV historical layout with amidships aircraft handling facilities, it just looks completely ugly as all sin and hilariously impractical. On the plus side, I've got a cross-deck firing 5.25 on the back, so that's increased the anti-aircraft firepower a little bit, albeit I personally, as you know, prefer the happy pancakes of the 4.5, but never mind. Now, would this be a good proposition? Well, there are, as you say, a number of savings. You're saving on belt armour, you're saving the length of your machinery, potentially increasing the field of fire of your anti-aircraft weapons, and you don't have to deal with the weight, well, in the final form of the KGVs, you don't have to deal with the weight of a twin 14-inch turret in addition, albeit your barbette is going to be slightly larger. So you are making a reasonable amount of weight savings. I don't think, if they did such a thing, I don't think they would go for bigger engines, because everyone's kind of happy mostly with 28 knots as a battleship top speed, which would be a difference compared to Richelieu. Whilst the Treasury would almost certainly want smaller and cheaper ships, I don't think they'd go for that either. Or at least the Royal Navy wouldn't, because it's the naval treaty. They need to build up to that treaty because they know everyone else is going to, at least. But yeah, you could fit more armour. So obviously I've indicated a small increase in anti-aircraft weaponry, but you could do more. Potentially, if you were going to go like full US system with aircraft just mounted right aft on catapults, you could potentially get a Richelieu-style ridge going down the aft there, maybe get a couple of 5.25s on that, and maybe another pair of 5.25s on the broadside, which would bring you up to, well, you'd be, compared to the King George V historical anti-aircraft armament, you'd be adding another 4 twin mounts, which would add 6 guns to each broadside, which would take your heavy anti-aircraft broadside from 8 guns up to 14 guns, which would be actually quite a ferocious broadside. And of course, later on, if you want, or perhaps at the time if you want, you could put octuple pom-poms or something on the centre ridge or on the broadside mounts or whatever. So there are options for increasing your anti-aircraft armament. You can, of course, get a bunch more armour because the armour belt is shorter, and so the King George of this will become even more insanely heavily armoured, which would be quite amusing. But at the same time, the Royal Navy, whilst historically, yes, against European navies, they liked to bring 2-to-1 odds if they could, they know they can't count on that. At which point, the single biggest sticking problem would be 8 14-inch guns in terms of total broadside weight, etc. It's just not going to cut it, I don't think. It's too little firepower. It basically puts you, roughly speaking, firepower-wise on parity with a Congo, which is at the low end of capital ships. Now, if you're going to make significant alterations to the historical KGB design like this, if you can persuade people to go with an all-forward arm and they're going with quad turrets, then maybe if they went with quad 15-inch 45s, i.e. the guns they almost put as triples, but didn't because of the treaty. Well, the treaty that the UK negotiated to bring everything from 16 down to 15-inch. Well, if you could get quad 15 or possibly even quad 16s, you'd get many of the weight savings. Admittedly, some of the weight savings would be going into providing with slightly larger caliber weaponry, but a British Richelieu with quad 15s, where it's 28 knots but more heavily protected than Richelieu, or even a British version where it's got quad 16s and heavier armour and stays at 28 knots, that I could potentially see being a viable alternate timeline path. F-19A Ghost Rider asks, if in 1940 the French fleet decided to defect against the Vichy government and join the British in continuing the fight, how do you think it could have affected the rest of the war? How do you think Germany would react to the Vichy government? Now, I think I've covered the first part of that question in a couple of Drydocks very recently with people who had very similar questions in terms of how's that going to affect the war, where are they going to go, etc., etc. But the latter part is something we haven't covered before. How do you think Germany would react to the Vichy government if this happened? Now, that's a very interesting thing, because one of the reasons that you sometimes see brought out by people as to why the French Navy, the Marine Nationale, didn't join up was because they were afraid of reprisals against their families. It's like, well, it's Hitler, and that's not even being retrospective. At that stage in the war, Hitler had literally broken every single agreement he had ever made with anybody on the international stage. So quite why the Vichy government thought that they would get a fair shout and, Hitler obeying the terms of the armistice that he signed with them this time, I don't know. And of course, actually, that very cynical point of view was proven right, because in 1942, just after Operation Torch, Hitler decided to occupy all of France. So, yeah, well done, Vichy government. It didn't really work out for you that much. And also, it comes into the fact that, and something that I usually say in response, and now, okay, the situation is slightly different because, technically speaking, France still exists in the form of the Vichy government, in some way, shape, or form, if you consider it legitimate. Obviously, the Free French themselves did not, and there was a whole argument in various French colonies as to which was the more legitimate continuation government of France, the Vichy French or the Free French. But from a broader perspective, in terms of, hey, the Germans have invaded us, and now they want control of our naval forces, and what are we going to do about it? Well, Belgians, Norwegians, Greeks, Polish, the Dutch, even some Danish vessels where they could, etc., etc., a couple of Yugoslavian vessels as well. They all basically went, stuff this for a laugh, we're going off to continue the fight. And, they would have known as much, if not more, than the French, that the Germans may very well retaliate against their loved ones. At least with Vichy France, if the Marine Nationale collectively goes, no, screw it, we're continuing to fight, at least a good chunk of the Marine Nationale's families are in Vichy France. So unless Vichy France wants to retaliate against them, those at least should be safe. Now, obviously, the ones in occupied France, that may be a different story. But point to literally every other European navy from every other European country that was occupied by the Germans, uniformly to a man turned around and went, no, we're continuing to fight, understanding what the consequences will be. So I don't think France gets a special case exemption from that. Everyone else had that same risk, and if not more so, and they accepted that risk. How would the Germans overall react? I think it would depend on how exactly it went down. So, obviously, Admiral Darlan at this point had been part of the Vichy government. If the Vichy government had said, no, we will agree to the treaty, the French ships will do what the treaty says, and Darlan has said, yes, this will happen, and then Darlan had turned around and just skedaddled off with the majority of the French fleet, then I think the Germans might have said, okay, well, Darlan was a representative of your government, he agreed to all of this, and then turned around and went behind our backs, so now we don't trust you, the treaty is broken. Occupation of France occurs in 40-41 as opposed to in 42. Conversely, if Darlan sticks to his guns and stays in the Vichy government and says, no, all Marine Nationale units must come back and must abide by the treaty terms, if some other popular charismatic admiral within the French fleet turns around and says, no, we're off, and it's very clear that the Vichy government is, doing its best but has lost all authority over its fleet, the Germans would be angry, obviously, but they would be hard-pressed to do all that much legally to the Vichy French government, because what basis would it be? It's like the Vichy French government has done its best to abide by the treaty terms. They can't necessarily be entirely blamed if their naval forces just decide, no, go away. And of course, if Darlan really wants to play both ends against the middle, he could officially, make all the gestures and noises about saying, no, you must come back, for the good of France, you must remain in Vichy ports, etc., etc., etc. But he could also secretly be sending out runners word of mouth saying, actually, go over there and follow ex-admiral and until this is all sorted out and Germany is defeated. And then he'd go down in the history books very favourably as someone who was able to, potentially help keep Vichy France out of German influence, at least for a while, whilst also sending the majority of the Marine Nationale off to fight. So how the Germans would react, I think, would depend an awful lot on how it was done. But ultimately, as I said, the Germans couldn't really do much worse than they historically had in their power to do to literally every other European navy whose country they'd invaded. So there is kind of a baseline there, I guess. Paul Goyne asks, the US Navy in World War I is often described as unbalanced due to its lack of modern cruisers. Ignoring for a moment the cruisers needed for things like commerce protection and commerce raiding, what was the appropriate ratio of capital ships to cruisers to destroyers for a battle fleet in this period? Now, I'm so glad you made that qualification, because otherwise, obviously, the first response would be depends on the fleet, because some fleets have a lot more colonial obligations, like the Royal Navy, and commerce protection obligations, as opposed to others that can focus on being a pure battle fleet. Now, when you're looking at just a battle fleet, well, we've got the order of battle available at Jutland as a very easy comparison. So if you look at the ratios of cruisers to capital ships and destroyers to capital ships, we can get some idea of what's going on, although that does require the rather major qualification of the fact that both of the fleets present were operating some relatively large detached forces centred on capital ships in the case of the Germans' first scouting group, in the case of the British, the battlecruiser fleet, and those obviously require their own escorts, which complicate things somewhat if you're looking at a battle fleet like the US, which obviously doesn't have any battle cruisers, or the Italians or the French or the Austro-Hungarians, or, well, the Japanese are the only other power at this point that do have battle cruisers, but nonetheless. However, overall, you need, at least as far as the fleets at Jutland seem to reflect, you need at least a couple of light cruiser squadrons for screening, or they call them light cruiser squadrons, you know what I mean. You need a couple of cruiser squadrons for screening ahead of you at a full fleet scale. You can get away with maybe just the one if you are a smaller battle fleet. And you need another one aft. You need some cruisers for signal repeating. And then you have destroyers basically able to cover flanks and front, back and sides, essentially. Now, what that adds up to, because of course the battle fleet itself is usually travelling in columns, so it's relatively compact, is if you add up all of the cruisers on the British side, you have 37 total capital ships, including battleships and battle cruisers, and 34 cruisers. On the German side, you have 27 capital ships, including the pre-dreadnoughts and the battle cruisers, and 11 cruisers. However, given the fact that the Germans had lost a reasonable number of their best lighter cruisers, the protected cruisers, and by Jutland had pretty much almost run out of armoured cruisers, I would suggest that the cruiser account present for the High Seas Fleet at the Battle of Jutland is probably artificially low and constrained by the fact they actually don't have that many cruisers left. Admittedly, at the same time, obviously, the British are screening, as I said, the battle cruiser fleet, and they have the 2 armoured cruiser squadrons, which aren't necessarily of particularly great value, so perhaps the British have slightly too many cruisers overall. But broadly speaking, then, if you take into account those factors and think about what the Germans ideally probably would have wanted, and make some adjustments for the British as well based on what they really needed, you're probably looking at maybe 2 cruisers for every capital ship ratio, so a 2/3 ratio for your battle fleet. So in the US case in 1916, assuming we go purely by dreadnoughts and allowing for the very recently commissioned Nevada and Oklahoma, that gives us 12 capital ships, and by the end of the year that's obviously joined by Pennsylvania and Arizona, which will give you 14. So that would suggest you would need, I mean, there's a certain minimum size, obviously, for cruiser squadrons as well, because you need to cover front and back at minimum. But that would suggest you would need at least around 8 to 10 scouting-type cruisers, i.e. 4, 5, 6-inch armed fast cruisers, not scout cruisers, because they tend to lead destroyer flotillas, and not the armoured cruisers, because the armoured cruisers in many cases are going to be slower. But of course, at that point, where do you also include things like the Connecticuts? And that would add another 6 ships to your capital line, which would make you either 18 or 20 ships strong, at which point you would be looking at something like 12 to 15 cruisers capable of doing the fleet scouting role. And I would suggest that I think for the US fleet, because you're hitting a certain minimum size requirement, I think you probably want 12 cruisers capable of the fleet scouting role, because then you can divide them up into 2 squadrons of 6, which would be quite nice for your fore and aft screen. Destroyers, however, there is a lot closer agreement. The total British destroyer numbers was about 2.14 destroyers per capital ship, and the Germans had about 2.26. So if you split it down the middle and say you need about 2.2 destroyers, then if you're going by the number of dreadnoughts only available, then that would suggest the US fleet would need somewhere between 26 to 30 destroyers for the ships they'd have in 1916. And if you include all the ships they get in 1916 plus the Connecticuts, it would suggest you need 44 destroyers. But obviously do remember that is purely destroyers for the battle fleet. And you have, in both the German and British cases, destroyer flotillas elsewhere doing other things. So effectively what those ratios would suggest is, one, yes, the US is completely out of cruisers because it has some cruisers, but they're either not fast enough or not big enough and mean enough to actually be meaningful fleet screening elements. And on paper, the US just about has enough destroyers to escort the battle fleet, assuming that basically every destroyer in its inventory is operational and is with the battle fleet, and it has no other destroyers elsewhere. So it was a little bit short of destroyers, although admittedly they were building a fair few in 1916. So they probably can just about, towards the end of World War I, scrape in a minimum threshold acceptable number of destroyers if they strip everything else, but they are badly, badly short of cruisers. But yeah, just to recap, the numbers at Jutland would broadly suggest you need about 2.2 destroyers for every capital ship and roughly about 0.65 cruisers for every capital ship. Michael Gilson asks, in the Age of Sail, sometimes large ships were turned into smaller ships as razes by removing the upper deck. I believe the US Navy did it quite a bit as artillery technology improved, but would the process be technically and economically feasible in the Age of Steam? For example, if you come out of the Washington Naval Treaty with more destroyers than you were allowed, could the excess be razed down to torpedo boats or cutters or some such? Now, actually, the Washington Naval Treaty didn't put any limits on destroyers. That would be the London Naval Treaty. The Washington Naval Treaty is almost exclusively concerned with aircraft carriers and battleships, with a few words to say about cruisers, but really doesn't say much about destroyers. The London Treaty then brought in additional restrictions precisely because people had been like, aha, well, I shall just build some very large destroyers then. But taking the spirit of your question in terms of razaying down excess destroyers, then in the context of where that would be applicable, the London Naval Treaty, there is a clause in the London Naval Treaty that would allow for something approaching that, and that would be the exemptions. So the exemptions are, if I can find the correct section, here we go. So naval service combatant vessels of 600 tons or less are completely unrestricted, but let's face it, even by the Washington Treaty, very, very small destroyers and torpedo boats, or you're not going to be able to get that amount of weight reduction because destroyers had already entered 1,000-ton plus. Even things like the Beagle class, which were 4 or 5 years old at the time of World War One breaking out, were 900 tons. So you're not going to drop 300 tons off of that without making the ship dangerously unstable. But in the second category, naval combatant vessels exceeding 600 tons but not exceeding 2,000 tons. Now, they're not allowed to have a gun above 6.1 or 6.1 inches, 155 millimeters. That's fine. Destroyers don't have those anyway, for the most part. Mount more than 4 guns above 3-inch caliber. Again, that's mostly fine. Most destroyers at the time of the London Naval Treaty are 4-gun ships, so they can basically retain their armament. Are designed or fitted to launch torpedoes. Now, that could be a problem, because obviously destroyers are designed to launch torpedoes. You could take them off and say they no longer are fitted with them, but they are still designed. The mounts would still be there, so you would have to do something like, build accommodation over the torpedo mounts, or some other way that would persuade people that it's no longer designed or fitted with the capability of launching torpedoes. And then lastly, is designed for a speed of greater than 20 knots. So the ship has to be less than 20 knots. So in theory, if you wanted to, if you razé down a ship, then in the London Naval Treaty context, you could remove and permanently, or at least apparently permanently, take out the torpedo launchers and either derate the engines or just remove some of the machinery. You'd have to probably put in ballast in exchange in order to drop the ship's speed down below 20 knots, at which point you just have a slow gun-based, gun-only destroyer. So perhaps if you wanted a fleet of anti-submarine warfare escorts, for example, you could replace the torpedo launchers with a set of depth charge rails and depth charge projectors, and then use some of the weight that you've got left over from the reduction in machinery to put a nice deep magazine of depth charges with a hoist or something like that. And that would be a kind of razade destroyer under the treaty terms. You wouldn't be able to take it down to being a torpedo boat, but it would be a useful auxiliary. Alternatively, you could use them as a bunch of training craft without the depth charge modifications, and if you just did an appearances-only removal of the torpedo tubes, then in theory, if you also very quietly stored the machinery away, maybe calling it spare parts, in warehouses, then in theory you could very rapidly reintegrate those vessels as full destroyers in time of war. Ferris asks, the interwar US Navy didn't mount torpedoes on their cruisers because they reasoned that it would be a liability in a gunfight or other high explosive kinetic forms of disapproval. On the one hand, it seemed like they were the only major navy to do so in World War II, but given the fate of numerous other contemporaries, like Mikuma, it seems like it might have been a good idea. What are your thoughts on the matter, and would you have done things differently than historical if you were in charge of Royal Navy cruiser procurement at the time? I'm guessing Axis and French navies would have kept their historical loadouts because, being smaller navies, they want to maximise their offensive potential. Now, the main reason, as you said, was, well, the US thought it was going to be a liability, but that's specifically because of a number of things. Now, some of which I discussed with Ryan Szymanski when I was over in Hawaii, so you'll have possibly seen that discussion on the Battleship New Jersey channel. But I think that it comes down to, one, the US by the interwar period is thinking about cruisers engaging actually surprisingly long-range gunfire beyond the reach of their torpedoes. So why have torpedoes if they're going to be fighting at ranges beyond the range of said torpedoes? And secondly, the US Navy is thinking in terms of its cruisers as two things: scouts and escorts. So fleet scouts, scouting force, etc., etc., and then escorts, whether that be gunline escorts protecting the battle fleet or anti-aircraft escorts also protecting the battle fleet and possibly also protecting the carriers in both the surface and anti-aircraft gun role. They aren't really thinking in terms of using their cruisers to attack enemy capital ships in anything other than maybe a supporting long-range gun bombardment. Whereas everybody else pretty much is. The Japanese, the cruisers are a key part of their their Kantai-Kessen decisive battle doctrine. They're covering them in torpedo launchers so that they can go in and they can torpedo both their US opposite numbers and potentially US battleships. And the Royal Navy is also thinking very differently. So with the Royal Navy, they are aware, because unlike the US, which has the benefit of largely thinking in terms of a single homogeneous fleet, the Royal Navy knows it's going to be spread out. And if it's going to be spread out, it's going to be facing, potentially with single cruisers or groups of cruisers, commerce raiders of various sizes, and they may be other cruisers, but an Arethusa versus an 8-inch cruiser, it's going to need something to level the playing field. They might be facing off against enemy capital ships, either as part of a battle fleet or on their own. If, say a cruiser squadron over in the Far East comes up against a hostile Japan before the rest of the fleet can get there. And the Royal Navy is also aware that even when it has a fleet there, it's not necessarily going to be a homogeneous fleet, because they're going to, in the case of a hypothetical war with Japan, even if Europe is at peace, they've still got to keep some ships around for their colonial duties. They've got to keep some ships keeping an eye on Europe to make sure it stays peaceful. So they might not have the numerical superiority that the US kind of usually assumed that they would have. With the Royal Navy, they're also thinking about not just we might not have numerical superiority, we might be numerically inferior, at which point you need every bit of punch that you can get for all of these situations on cruisers, and that means you need torpedo launchers. And the Royal Navy's cruisers did use their torpedo launchers on a fair number of occasions during the Second World War. So if I was in charge of Royal Navy cruiser procurement, I probably would have done a few things differently, but keeping the torpedo launchers would definitely be something I would maintain. I wouldn't be getting rid of torpedo launchers on British cruisers anytime soon, because their use cases are very, very different. For the US, it is a little bit difficult, to be honest, because you can't use something like the First Battle of Savo Island as an example, because torpedo launchers or not, those ships were pretty much doomed. They never really got much of a shot off. But when you look at the way that US cruisers tended to fight, by and large, shore bombardment, carrier escort, battleship escort, a little bit of scouting, the US doctrine of not having torpedo launchers worked pretty well for them. But there were a few cases, mostly around Guadalcanal and then later the Solomons campaign, where the US was being forced to fight on a much more even or potentially even disadvantageous playing field. And in a number of those cases, having torpedo launchers on their cruisers might have actually been of significant assistance in taking down some Japanese vessels. Of course, given how many US ships were hit by long lances and so forth during those campaigns, that may also have gone even more badly for the US ships if the torpedoes had gone off or something like that. But, swings and roundabouts. John Comtois asks, there has been a lot of coverage about the sudden shift from pre-dreadnoughts to dreadnoughts, but were those pre-dreadnoughts themselves a sea change from some earlier standard type? Or was perhaps the late 1800s era just so full of swift change that at some point pre-dreadnought types just emerged gradually? So yes, pre-dreadnoughts were themselves a sea change, but not from a standard earlier type. Much as dreadnought herself combined, mini guns with turbines and so forth and etc., the pre-dreadnought type, as we would now come to define it, did combine a large number of innovations into one standard type that made it significantly superior to its predecessors. The difference being, as I said, there wasn't really a standard predecessor. So you had, for example, just within the Royal Navy, you had the Victoria class with a pair of massive guns up front. Then you also had the Trafalgar class, or the Admiral class, like this. This is Benbow, with one massive gun at each end. Unifying factor, low freeboard. And you had all sorts. You had, the Italias running around. You had various early French extreme tumble-home ships running around. You had ships that had twin guns, fore and aft, but a lot of open barbettes going on, etc. Now, what the pre-dreadnoughts introduced, basically in the form of the Majestic class and various successors in various fleets, was a move from compound armour, so steel backed by iron, or in some cases nickel steel. That moved over to Harvey steel, and the move to Harvey steel allowed the same or greater protection with significantly less thickness of metal. With significantly less thickness of metal, you could now afford to have much higher freeboard ships. So the low freeboard that was pretty much universal for most previous battleships went away. So you now had a high freeboard vessel. Also, because again, you had a lot more weight and the protection that you needed was considerably thinner and therefore lighter, you could also now enclose your gun houses, or enclose your barbettes and have an armoured gun house, which is the start of what we would today recognise as a battleship's turret, because previously, obviously, a battleship's turret mostly looked like a biscuit tin anyway, but also had to be very, very thick, therefore very, very heavy, and thus was abandoned in favour of the open barbette, whereas with the pre-dreadnought, if you have a Harvey steel gun house, then that can be shaped and made in a way that is light enough to be viable even on a high freeboard ship, which you couldn't do before. Vertical triple expansions, you can kind of argue maybe, but there were vertical triple expansion engines on previous to pre-dreadnought ships as well, so maybe that's not such a strong issue. The other thing was guns. There are two main advances in the field of guns. One was that better propellant and better metallurgy led to longer barreled, more powerful weapons. So that's why Benbow here and Victoria had 16.25-inch guns, and various other ships in other navies have had equally large or similarly large guns. And then all of a sudden with the Majestics, it drops down to 12-inch guns, because these guns are longer range and they actually fire a projectile that's capable of better armor penetration because of this combination of longer barrel and greater power behind the charges proportional to the bore size. And the last thing that pre-dreadnoughts introduce is the other aspect of the gunnery, which is the quick-firing gun, because you had some quick-firing guns in pre-dreadnoughts, if you like, but they were the anti-torpedo boat weapons, and that's why you see whole ranges of weapons being used on various warships. Then when you get into the pre-dreadnought era, that is almost commensurate with the introduction of the quick-firing gun in 6-inch. Now, it's not entirely perfectly aligned, but broadly speaking it is. And That means that you have quick-firing 6-inch guns, so your secondaries now have this quick-firing technology, and thus you get the idea of this hail of fire, because prior to that, slower-firing 6-inch guns meant that while they were nice to have, they didn't fire tremendously quicker than the main guns, and the main guns fired really slowly. The new 12-inch guns obviously could fire quicker than a 16.25-inch gun, and the 6-inch quick-firers could fire a lot quicker. So you still kept around some smaller caliber weapons for anti-torpedo boat work, but as you go through the pre-dreadnought period, you see those sort of tertiary and quaternary batteries gradually begin to diminish and effectively go away in favour of larger and larger secondary batteries of quick-firing 6-inch or near enough equivalent secondaries, or in some cases where you start to see people putting 7-inch or 8-inch or 7.5-inch or whatever before you get to the semi-dreadnought era, the quick-firing 6-inch is a tertiary battery. So to sum that all up, the pre-dreadnought introduces higher freeboards courtesy of Harvey steel armour, which allows for enclosed gun houses and the aforementioned higher freeboards and proper belt protection, and it introduces the smaller caliber but longer range and more powerful new main battery guns, usually 12-inch, and it introduces the quick-firing 6-inch as a secondary. So they are quite a sea change compared to previous vessels. TY asks, why weren't captured World War I and World War II ships, like those of the High Seas Fleet or the Kriegsmarine, etc., given to smaller Allied navies like Poland and Greece? Essentially, two main reasons. One, there weren't that many of them left. Once the High Seas Fleet had obviously scuttled itself in Scapa Flow for the large part, there wasn't a huge amount of the High Seas Fleet left to go around. And after World War II, well, an awful lot of the Kriegsmarine had been bombed and sunk, especially in the last few months of World War II. I mean, it was significantly reduced by 1945, but the number of surviving ships diminished rapidly during the last closing months of the Second World War, and pretty much the same with the Japanese fleet in World War II. Now, the problem with dividing the survivors up, as there's really not that many, and they tend to be from random odds and ends, and the last thing a small navy needs, if they're planning to have, say, half a dozen destroyers, is half a dozen destroyers from 4 different classes, usually quite badly worn, possibly damaged, not necessarily in the greatest state of repair, and then it makes them dependent on a country that in the aftermath of the Second World War has been bombed flat, and in the case of Germany has been split. And in the case of World War I Germany, or post-World War I Germany, is in the process of undergoing a social revolution and has a absolutely colossal war indemnity imposed on it by the Allies. So, if you're going to be operating the ships, quite apart from the various class differences and the wear and tear issues you're likely to get, you've also got to somehow persuade them to part with spare parts, which is going to be quite difficult if you're a small navy and from a small nation that doesn't really have much sway over that larger nation. There were a few ships that from the captured or surrendered navies that were used in other navies. France, for example, after both wars operated a number of German ships, more after the First World War than the Second, through absolute necessity. But of course, as one of the larger winning powers in World War I, they got to pick and choose. And of course, as one of the ones leveraging the war indemnity, they could basically get what spare parts they needed out of the Germans by assessing their value against the amount of money the Germans owed them. So, unfortunately, on the smaller scale, as I said, it's just not really feasible for the smaller navies. And on the larger scale, if they were going to have 1 or 2 large ships, again, you've still got the spare parts issue, you've still got the wear and tear issue, plus, of course, larger ships like heavy cruisers, for example, would have been designed by their respective navies to operate as part of a larger navy with a larger infrastructure support base and the maintenance requirements thereof. When you look at the cruisers that tend to be built for smaller navies like Gotland, Ventisingra de Mayo, the coastal defence ships of the Thai Navy, and etc., they tend to be smaller diminutives, not full-size or oversized treaty 10,000 tonners or more. I mean, even in the 1950s, when the South American countries are acquiring Brooklyn-class cruisers like it's going out of fashion, the Brooklyn at that point is several stages behind the latest and greatest in light cruiser design. So in those cases, essentially, it's better for the small navy to just buy some customized ships for their purposes from a supplier who's going to be a bit more reliable and can give them a uniform fleet. Unfortunately, for all the reasons aforementioned, larger navies going, here, smaller allied navy, we can give you some of our defeated enemy ships, is not too far away from, here you go, small ally, have a fine. Commander James Pearl asks, I'd appreciate some help looking for the man who founded the city I'm currently living in, a Commander James Pearl. The information I've got so far is that he was promoted to commander on September 29, 1827, given a plot of land that would eventually become Mount Pearl in 1829 for dedicated service to the Royal Navy, and that he passed away sometime around about 1840. I have no information on his actual service or anything else, so any information you could dig up would help greatly. Well, rejoice, for I believe I have found some stuff for you. It was a little bit of a fun chase, but I managed to find, for example, the short biography that was published for him when he was promoted to the rank of commander. So allow me to read for you. Obtained the rank of lieutenant on the 21st of December 1808, he was the second of the Mediator fire ship, Captain James Woolridge, at the attack of a French squadron near Isle d'Aix, I think, on April 1809. Speaking of this service, Mr. James says, several of the fire ships were ignited and abandoned long before they got abreast of even the northernmost of the two vessels stationed as guides. Others again were admirably conducted, especially the Mediator, the largest and most efficient of the whole. This ship, from her great weight and the strength of wind and tide, broke the boom and thus afforded a clear passage to the others. So determined was the Mediator's gallant commander to see the service he had engaged in properly executed that he himself and officers and men who had volunteered to accompany him nearly perished along with their vessel. The gunner was killed, and Captain Woolridge, Lieutenants Nicholas Brent Clements and James Pearl, and one seaman were blown out of the ship, the three latter slightly, but the captain very severely scorched. The fortunate circumstance of the Mediator, formerly a 32-gun frigate, being fitted as a fire ship, was the means of the success by which British arms were so gloriously crowned, as all the other fire vessels were so small and light, mostly being transport brigs, that none of them could possibly have force to the boom. She was not set on fire till long after the boom had been broken, many minutes after the vessel conducted by Lord Cochrane had exploded, nor until she was within the buoys of L'Océan, 120-gunner, flagship of Vice Admiral Allemand. Her gallant commander was immediately advanced to post rank, being presented by order of his sovereign with a gold chain and medal, and by the Patriotic Society at Lloyd's with a sword value 100 shillings. Lieutenant Clements was made a commander and received a sword value 60 shillings. Lieutenant Pearl was presented with one of similar value, but unfortunately he had not served sufficient time as a commissioned officer to render him eligible for promotion. In the ensuing summer, Lieutenant Pearl was appointed to the Harpy sloop, Captain George William Blammy, formerly commander of the Mediator, under whom he served in that vessel, and the Comet 20, gunner at the reduction of Walcheren, and on various foreign stations for upwards of 5 years. He obtained his present rank on the 29th of September 1829. I also managed to find a copy of the document ADM 196-68-225 in the National Archives. Unfortunately, it is an incredibly low-quality scan, but it does confirm it is talking about the same person because it lists his service on the Mediator starting on the 21st of February 1804 as a lieutenant. Unfortunately, most of the discharge dates are fairly illegible in the scan, so I can't really make them out. But it does say he served aboard it for 1 month, 3 weeks and 1 day, so it discharged 11th of April, presumably 1804. It then lists his service in the Harpy starting on the 5th of July 1809, and discharge on what looks like the 13th of November, and I'm going to guess that's 1810 based on the fact he's supposed to have served on it for 1 year, 1 month, 2 weeks and 6 days. Oh, I can't. No, 4 months. Sorry, the scan is awful. Then he picks up with the Valiant on the 14th of November 1810. discharge on the 1st of March looks like 1812, which would correspond with 1 year, 3 months, 3 weeks and 3 days in service. Then the Comet, 3rd of March 1812 to the 26th of December, again presuming 1814 on the basis of 2 years, 10 months, 2 weeks and 5 days service. Then the York on the 20th of May 1815, which he's then away from on the 26th of August, presumably of the same year, because he's listed as having 3 months, 2 weeks and 0 days service there. And then the last ship, the name of which is very difficult to make out. I can't make it out exactly. It looks like, to be honest, I couldn't really tell you. Something ing, possibly, no, Starling, maybe Starling. I think it's Starling. February 7th, 1827 through to 9th of October 1827. That being, I think, some months, 3 weeks and no days. So total accrued sea time, 6 years, 7 months, 1 week and 6 days. And this has been written when he is a commander, so it's written in 1827. As I say, pretty poor quality scan, but hopefully that is useful to you. The other element that I was able to pick up for him, a couple of things I was able to pick up in relation to him, is that at some point he seems to have picked up the title Sir James Pearl. He was born in 1789 and died in 1840 at Mount Pearl in Newfoundland, Canada. He had a wife, Lady Anne Hawkins Pearl, and he had some siblings, at least 2 of which predeceased him. His father was David Simeon Pearl. His mother was Eunice Allen Pearl. So then, I say at least 3 siblings. Now, the other thing, which may be a connection, may not, which I found in a magazine called Down Home Magazine, A Tale of Two Pearls. Now, you'll notice he, in his service record and also in his Commander's Commission record, you have service in the Napoleonic Wars, and then after 1815, not a lot seems to happen until he picks up possibly on the Starling in 1827. But in this article in Down Home Magazine, they ran into somebody who apparently who knows about James Pearl from Singapore. And I thought, well, this seems a little bit odd because some of the ranks don't add up. But there is a common thread, a merchant ship called the Indiana in 1819. So whilst the following, obviously there is, as the article notes, there is some conjecture, there does seem to indicate that Indiana was constructed in India in 1818, made of teak, sheathed in copper, with a crew of 54. The James Pearl that would eventually settle in Newfoundland, so that's the one that we're tracking, had taken a leave of absence from the Royal Navy, which would seem to be indicated by his last service in it being 1815, prior to his service on the Starling. And according to the researchers, he seems to have sailed to Asia to work as a free trader to pay off gambling debts, where he purchased the Indiana. And the Indiana was the ship that brought Sir Stamford Raffles from Penang to Singapore in 1819, which kind of sets off the whole train of events, because Raffles oversees control of the island being transferred to the East India Company, which eventually then means it becomes a British colony. So that's kind of the start of it all. And it also seems that James Pearl spent some time covertly building up plots of land in the area and building a business for himself. And he's still there paying off his debts in 1821. He takes the Indiana to Calcutta. He engages in the opium trade. At that point, still, the sale of opium is mostly legal at this point. Now, this opium couldn't be carried to China at that point, at least according to China, by ships of the East India Company, but private traders could. But he didn't actually get very far because at the time the ports were being blockaded, so that voyage was sold at a loss. The opium didn't actually end up going to China, so that's just more debts. In any case, he builds up his land plot on this hill in Singapore. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out because he falls out with Raffles, who's returned as governor. He then leaves Singapore in 1826, having sold up his properties, and at that point that would mesh with his brief service on the Starling in 1827, whereupon he acquires the rank of commander, and then he moves over to Newfoundland and acquires a grant of land, and then has a big falling out with Thomas Cochrane, who's the governor there at the time, and that kind of hopefully brings everything up to current. So that's what I've been able to find on James Pearl, and apparently the picture that's been gracing your screens for the last however long of 10 minutes or so is apparently of James Pearl, although again that's apparently can't necessarily be confirmed. So hopefully you found some of that useful, and if you want a copy of that National Archives document, just drop me an email or something and I'll happily send it to you. Okage asks, where would Mikasa's shot fall if she fired her guns? I recall from the tour guides that the guns are locked off at about a 4.5 degree loading angle. And if you can get footage or photos from Mikasa, what would you want? And what questions would you like to ask the staff? As far as footage or photos from Mikasa, well, anything is welcome. Some good profile shots of the ship, some up close of the armament and the bridge are always good. I don't know really what's inside. I think there's a museum inside, in which case if they've got some models and some art or some artifacts, those would always be good. Questions to ask the staff. Ooh. To be honest, when I ask staff from museum ships, I usually come up with questions on the spot based on what I'm seeing. So that would be rather difficult. I might have to get back to you on that. But in terms of the guns, now I can't find range tables specifically for Mikasa's guns, but I can find some range tables for guns that have very similar performance. So approximately speaking, at a 4.5 degree loading angle, I think the guns are probably going to reach about 7,000 yards. Now, that means obviously Mikasa has two sets of guns, one fore, one aft. If she fired her forward guns, therefore, the shells would actually, in a remarkable turn of events for one of these questions, we don't actually have to ignore intervening buildings and the like. They would just land in the sea, approximately almost directly east of Yokohama City University Hospital, just fractionally north of east of the Aqua Museum. So if you went to what looks like their helipad, or no, it's the helipad for the Yokohama Fire Department Aviation Unit, which is right at the corner of the coastline where the Yokohama City University Hospital is. It's almost, the shells would land almost exactly 2.5 kilometers away, in going dead east into the sea. Now, obviously, there's the aft guns as well. Now, in this case, we would have to ignore some low-level intervening hills potentially, but assuming they are at a 4.5 degree loading angle, and assuming my figures are about right, that would mean the shells would almost certainly land in what looks like a patch of forest just immediately west of the Iwato Special Education School, and also just immediately south of west of the Yokosuka Shiritsu Iwato Junior High School, which are usefully named in English as well as Japanese. Not too far from the Mishima Shrine, but kind of to the north, to the east by northeast of that, much closer to the Special Education School, having just buzzed what looks like a block of housing. So yeah, that's where the Mikasa's guns would land. And final question for this half, because of course it's the Patreon Drydock, Ash the Lego guy asks, aside from being French, why was Surcouf's rotating torpedo launcher not used in other submarine designs? Essentially because the design is really only in any way, shape or form useful on a cruiser submarine. Because, well, they're also a little bit odd in that they have one there's 2 trainable launchers, and because of space considerations, I guess, they have 1 full-sized torpedo and 2 smaller lightweight torpedoes per launcher. So, yeah, that's slightly odd. But in any case, as I said, only really usable that much on a cruiser submarine. They're external to the ship's pressure hull. So unlike the forward torpedo tubes, they cannot be reloaded. They're one shot and done unless you're somehow going to contrive to reload them at sea. But I don't see that happening without a submarine tender at the very least. If not, having to go all the way back to port. And one and done torpedo tubes generally don't seem to have all that much favour in most submarine designs. You only really tend to get them in cases of absolute necessity, like say on the T-class, where the British are desperate to have this massive forward torpedo battery, and eventually when that's turned around to give them some shots aft, but generally a reloadable tube is preferred. And obviously they're also complicated, so can possibly be damaged, can possibly be jammed. They're also, as I said, external to the ship, so there's a potential that the torpedoes themselves could become damaged and cause, in turn, if they happen to detonate, damage to the ship itself much more easily if the ship's being depth charged or shelled, as opposed to torpedoes that are internal to the ship, which would require you to breach the pressure hull to really do all that much to them. But as I said, from a cruiser submarine perspective, if Surcouf is surfaced and engaging in a broadside fight with its 8-inch guns against an enemy vessel, then of course being able to train torpedoes at that vessel and loose them before diving would be quite a useful feature. But that's really about the only kind of use there is for them. And of course Surcouf is a relatively late in the game cruiser submarine, so potentially other cruiser submarines, had cruiser submarines been allowed to continue, might also have adopted this kind of approach. But in their absence, if you're going to go through the space and weight take up of sticking 6 torpedoes of various sizes with 2 trainable triple launchers that are all one-shot deals on the back of your submarine, and bear in mind Surcouf also has a recon aircraft as well as our 8-inch guns, well, you can probably get just as many, if not more, torpedoes in reloadable tubes aft, which gives you a lot more discretion about using them in a more submarine underwater role, and you can probably just have more torpedoes generally. So that's essentially why the launchers were not really used in any other submarine thereafter. And now, on to part 2.